Everyone, welcome to the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce. And it will now come to order. Today, I will be holding a hearing entitled Safeguarding American Consumers, Fighting Scams and Fraud During the Pandemic. And due to COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing will be conducted entirely remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conference. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses will need to unmute your microphones each time that you wish to speak. I'll try and remind you. Additionally, members will need to be visible on screen in order to be recognized. Documents for the record can be sent to Ed Kazmierski at Kazmierski, sorry, and at the email address that we have provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. Before I recognize myself for an opening statement, I want to take a point of personal privilege. And recognize some of all of the new members to our subcommittee. And first, let me just recognize the Democrats. We have Kathleen Rice from New York, Angie Craig from Minnesota, Lizzie Fletcher from Texas, and Lori Trahan from Massachusetts. So welcome to the Democratic new members. I will mention the new members also on the Republican side, and afterwards I'm going to welcome the new ranking member, Gus Bilirakis from Florida, who's been on this committee but not on the subcommittee before, and I'm so happy to have him. But let me just mention the GOP members. We have Neil Dunn from Florida, Debbie Lesko from Arizona, Greg Pence from Indiana, and Kelly Armstrong from North Dakota. Welcome all. I'm so happy. I hope you are now to be on this important subcommittee. So I'm going to see if Congressman Bilirakis, our ranking member, has some words to say. Let me turn it over to you. Oh, let me first just say we do have new staff. I already messed up his name once. As Ed Kazmierski, and I also just wanted to mention that we have a new acting chair of the Federal Trade Commission. She's been on the commission before, but Rebecca Kelly Slaughter. So Gus, Representative and Ranking Member Bilirakis, go ahead.
Sure. Yes, Chair. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I look forward to working with you for our constituents and well, the whole country. This is a wonderful, wonderful committee, the best committee in Congress. And I'm really looking forward to, I do have a prepared statement, but I'm really looking forward to working also with the Republican leader, Kathy McMorris Rogers, my great friend. So again, you recognize the new members. I think we have an all-star team here. These new members, Dr. Dunn from Florida, and of course, Mr. Pence, who we just spoke with, and has some great ideas from Indiana, and then Ms. Lesko, I admire so much. She does a great job for the team and for her district as well from Arizona. And then Mr. Armstrong from North Dakota. So, and again, all the new members on the Democrat side as well. We're going to work and get things done for the American people. So with that, I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I'm excited about Representative Bill Rockus. He was voted in Florida the most effective member of Congress because of all the bills that he actually got passed into law. So I am looking forward to seeing that kind of performance in a bipartisan way here also in the committee. So at this point, I will recognize myself for an opening statement of 5 minutes. So again, good morning and welcome to our hearing on the Federal Trade Commission and its response to COVID-19. The Federal Trade Commission was established in 1914 through an act of Congress and is inexorably linked to our committee and particularly to the work of our subcommittee. And of course, you know that the Energy and Commerce Committee is the oldest standing committee in Congress, originally stood up to regulate interstate and international commerce. And like this committee, the Federal Trade Commission was tasked with regulating interstate commerce. It's the only agency with jurisdiction over both consumer protection and competition issues. Many critics, myself included, frankly, would argue that the Federal Trade Commission has not lived up to its potential over the last, 40 years. But yesterday, the FTC announced a remarkable settlement with Amazon over its systemic stealing of delivery drivers' tips. Imagine. This is an example of the sort of announcement I had hoped that the new acting chairwoman would make a sign that the Federal Trade Commission would be taking on big cases that serve as a true deterrent to illegal conduct by those who might prey on American consumers. But we must recognize that this settlement would not have been possible without the threat of the Federal Trade Commission using its Section 13B authority. I'll explain. Under 13B, the Federal Trade Commission can require defrauders to provide restitution money to individuals who have been defrauded. Unfortunately, this authority is under assault right now at the Supreme Court, and the FTC may find itself deprived of a critical tool. Additionally, companies that defraud consumers make it hard on honest businesses to be able to conduct their business and to gain the trust of consumers. So I would hope that organizations like the Chamber of Commerce would recognize that rooting out bad actors and returning stolen funds to consumers is important for them and for everyone. Luckily, the Federal Trade Commission, in a bipartisan way, has reaffirmed the authority of Section 13B. So all the commissioners are on board, but it should be, we should all be on board. Specifically, the specific to COVID-19, the Federal Trade Commission has been very aggressive in investigating fraud that originates online. The agency has sent hundreds of takedown letters, but has not really gone after the major cause of the problem, which is negligence by platforms. These platforms are not unwitting co-conspirators, but rather partners in profit. Platforms must demonstrate real efforts toward keeping scammers off their sites. Especially now, of course, and with consumers relying more on the internet for their shopping. I would like to see the subcommittee pass what I've called the Informed Consumer Act, which would require online platforms to verify the identity of their third-party sellers. This would go a long way toward protecting Americans. And I hope that this Congress, this subcommittee, can pursue a 21st century consumer rights agenda in a bipartisan way, and make sure that consumer rights that exist in the physical world also extend to the online world. I am looking forward to the direction that the FTC acting chair will take and protecting consumers, and using all the tools including the franchise rule, the funeral home rule, and pursue more when it comes to unfair practices, unfair cases. So I want to thank the witnesses who are here for joining us today. I now will recognize Mr. Bilirakis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, I want to thank all the members of the committee. Welcome to the Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee hearing of the 117th Congress. I'd like to congratulate again you, Madam Chair, for another term leading this great subcommittee where we promise innovation, champion emerging technologies, and protecting consumers. And I'm greatly looking forward to working with you. And I want to thank also the Republican leader for giving me, the ENC leader for giving me the opportunity to serve on the committee. I appreciate it so much. And to to be the ranking member of the lead Republican on the CPC. So again, I want to thank Ms. Rogers for giving me the opportunity to lead as a Republican, and congratulate her on leading the committee on the Republican side, and also look forward to working with the full committee chair, who's a good friend of mine as well, Mr. Pallone. I know Kathy is going to do a great job as our leader to help the American people as well. Today, we will explore steps we can take to advance our fight against fraud and scams, which is so important to, again, especially during this pandemic. Millions are forced to isolate and remain in their homes, and bad actors continue to exploit consumers' fears, their fear and confusion. Some promising fake reservations for the coronavirus vaccines, again, fake is the word that I want to use. Stimulus checks, fake. Loans for small businesses struggling to stay afloat. And of course, we want to discuss the Super Bowl tickets. And I'm hoping that my Tampa Bay Buccaneers will prevail on Sunday. Just earlier this year in my district in Pasco County, I represent Pasco, which is the Tampa Bay area, as well as Pinellas and Hillsborough counties. The health departments discovered use of a fake Eventbrite website being used to charge money for registrations for the COVID vaccine. Inexcusable. This fake website was a complete scam, whereas we know vaccine registration is completely free. We must continue to protect consumers from falling victim to scams, and it not only cripples individuals financially, but can also cause serious mental health issues and lead to suicide, again, particularly during this pandemic. We made great progress on this subcommittee last year. We enacted HR 6435, the Combating Pandemic Scams Act, led by Representative Carter, along with Representatives Hudson, Custer, and Rochester. With the efforts of our friends at the FTC, this law will focus give us the tools and resources on vulnerable communities to better educate and protect them from scams. Unfortunately, scammers are continuing to find new ways to exploit vulnerable Americans during COVID-19. With people remaining locked in their homes, many head online for social interaction, particularly our seniors. The bad guys know this and take advantage of it. And the FTC has already found that people are increasingly falling victim, unfortunately, to scams through social media platforms. This must stop. And just first 6 months of 2020, scams originated from social media tripled, resulting in 117 million in losses. With more consumers tuning in to these platforms, scammers create fake profiles offering connection, friendship, or economic relief, only to steal information and hard-earned dollars. These scams will often come by way of a friend request, and direct messages or advertisements. As the FTC continues to publish helpful information on best practices, I urge big tech platforms. I urge them that they should help your users remain vigilant against scams and fraud. Bad actors will resort to any means to steal money and information. We know that. They will create fake profiles, calls for new phone numbers, and even try to mask their identity as a friend or family member. The best preventative measure is education, as you all know, and entities across the country working in unison to share educational materials. And we must have a duty to share these materials with our constituents. If consumers know what to look for, they will be better equipped to avoid these scams. I commend the FTC for their tireless work fighting on behalf of consumers. However, they cannot do it alone. There must be greater collaboration. I'm over my time, Madam Chair. I'm just, can I ask for another 20 seconds? If not, that's okay. We'll discuss these issues during the meeting, and I apologize for going over my time. And I'll yield back.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish.
Is it okay? All right. I'm very. I'll be finished. There must be greater collaboration and cooperation with state and local law enforcement, as you know. Collaboration, cooperation for merchants and platforms and communities to better educate consumers on best practices to avoid falling for scams and to increase efforts to hold bad actors accountable. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to learning how to better strengthen protections for Americans from scams and frauds. And this is a great way to lead, Madam Chair. Thanks for having agenda in this particular meeting. So important. Thank you. And I'll yield back.
When I listen to you, I can see that we're really on the same page on so many things. And now the gentleman yielded back, and I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Schakowsky, and it's good to see our new ranking member, Gus Bilirakis, as well. Good to see you both. I wanted to, let me just say, my concern, of course, we have a situation now where we have safe and effective vaccines, and we're trying to push them out. But while these vaccines provide real hope, there's new variants of the coronavirus, you know, that are now spreading that are highly transmissible. And for consumers, these new strains are causing a renewed panic. I'm sure you're hearing about this from your constituents. And another scramble for personal protective equipment, intense demand for vaccine appointments. But for scammers and fraudsters, this is exactly the kind of fear and desperation that they seize and thrive on. So that's why I think that this hearing is so important, not only to deal with the scams and frauds that we've seen in the last 10 months, but now, even more opportunity for scams and frauds because of the fear that a lot of people have with these new variants. And overall, the pandemic has just upended American life, pushing so many aspects of consumer lives to the online realm. And you get all these fly-by-night businesses, they're just a click away, and fraudsters that can assume different identities. And there's con artists that really pose threats to consumers' health, safety, and financial well-being. And these sellers, these unscrupulous sellers on the internet are sophisticated. They flood fees to drive traffic to their suspect goods. They include counterfeit and substandard personal protective equipment, sham testing kits, bogus cures. But the products they're selling can endanger the health, and their online stores may just be a front to scam consumers. And the number of reports about scams originating on social media has more than tripled in the past year. And these scams, Madam Chair, have been particularly harmful to older Americans and senior citizens. I know you've been involved with the senior task force for so many years, Jan. And this isolation, a lot of these people are isolated now, these seniors, and that's left them particularly vulnerable to fraudsters. For example, online puppy scams and romance scams have risen precipitously during the pandemic. And some of the worst fraudsters are the identity thieves stealing stimulus checks and unemployment benefits from those already struggling to pay their bills. To make matters worse, these people are often targeted for fake employment scams, deceptive income schemes, and unwise investment solicitations. So I wanted to applaud both the chairwoman and Congressman Bouchon for their bipartisan work in giving the Federal Trade Commission new authority to seek civil penalties for COVID-19 scams. That was in the 2021 Omnibus End of the Year package. And that provision empowers the FTC to dole out real consequences to bad actors. They've reported losing more than 300 million, consumers have lost more than 300 million in just pandemic-related fraud. Now, one of the concerns I have, though, is that the FTC's ability to make victims whole is under threat in the Supreme Court. And that's why it's critical that the FCC step up its efforts to protect consumers. I know that Tony Cardenas has a bill to deal with this power of restitution that we feel is under threat, and he's going to talk about that. But the former FTC chairman, Joseph Simmons, I think insulated some of the worst that came out, some of these scams because of, and was very critical sometimes of the Trump administration. But the agency really needs to show its teeth now. And because since the beginning of the pandemic, the FTC has issued numerous warning letters, but warning letters are nothing. They're really just a slap on the wrist. So I want to hear from the panel, but before that, I'd like to yield the time remaining to Tony Cardenas, who I know he has some important legislation that I mentioned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Federal Trade Commission is the country's premier consumer protection agency and respected internationally and as a leader in consumer protection. For example, just in the last 5 years alone, they returned $11 billion in refunds to victimized consumers. As the chairman mentioned, this authority to secure monetary relief for consumer victims under Section 13B of the FTC Act currently hangs in the balance in the United States Supreme Court. Should the court rule against the FTC, American consumers will pay the price. As warned in a remarkable bipartisan letter from all 5 FTC commissioners to the committee last October, and I quote, it says, "It is imperative that the Congress act quickly so that the FTC can continue to effectively protect American consumers." I'd like to submit that letter for the record, Madam Chair, and I plan to introduce legislation in response to the bipartisan call to ensure the FTC's continued ability to return consumer and victims their resources. I welcome working with my Republican colleagues on this issue. I note that Senator Wicker introduced legislation last Congress to address 13B, and I hope we can continue to work in a bipartisan way on this. Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
And I yield back as well, Madam Chair.
Oh, there we go. That will be submitted in the record at the end of the hearing today. And let me now both congratulate and recognize Congresswoman McMorris Rogers, and for now being the ranking member on the full committee, and for her 5 minutes on this subcommittee. You are recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. A big welcome to everyone to the first Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee of the 117th Congress. Last Congress, I had the pleasure of working very closely with the Chair Jan Schakowsky, as I was the subcommittee Republican leader, and I'm very proud that we were able to accomplish some significant bipartisan priorities. We reauthorized the U.S. Safe Web Act to ensure international cooperation against scams and frauds, which has never been more important. We also got the American Compete Act signed into law, and I really appreciate the help and Chairman Pallone's help in getting this included in the end-of-year package. This bill will play an important role in widely deploying emerging technologies, many of which are also being used right now to respond to the pandemic. We also made great bipartisan strides on privacy protections, and I hope that we can build on the bipartisan, bicameral achievements from the end of last year and get a federal privacy law signed this year as soon as possible. I also want to congratulate my friend from Florida, Gus Bilirakis, for taking on the leadership of this subcommittee for the Republicans. I have every confidence he's going to do a great job. He's someone that digs in and really does the hard work of legislating to get results. And I'm excited about what we will be able to accomplish for the American people and how we will be able to help win the future. These have been some difficult times, unprecedented times. Millions of citizens remain trapped inside their homes with little social interaction. In addition to worsening our country's mental health and substance abuse crisis, this isolation has created opportunities for bad actors to exploit Americans' pain. Last Congress, this subcommittee helped combat these bad actors and empower vulnerable communities to not become victims. Buddy Carter's Combating Pandemic Scams Act was signed into law at the end of last year. And I'm glad that we're continuing the good work of this subcommittee at the beginning of this year. As Mr. Bilirakis discussed, there's several scams to be on the lookout for and lies about COVID vaccines and attempts to steal stimulus checks, as well as the good old gift card scams that are on the rise. I want to thank and welcome Tracy Ponto. She's from Spokane, Washington. She's with Spokane Cops, Community-Oriented Policing Services. And she's one of our witnesses today. She's going to be sharing some of her insights on a range of scams that she sees and her work to protect and serve Eastern Washington. Education is the best prevention. And I know your dedication to that and your cooperation with law enforcement is getting results for victims. I also want to thank our allies at the Federal Trade Commission. They're on the front lines, educating our communities about the risk of COVID scams and holding bad actors accountable. And just as I said during our work on privacy protections, we need a strong national standard and a regulator who is empowered to enforce that standard. The FTC has long relied on Section 13B of the FTC Act to obtain and enforce a range of remedies against certain illegal conduct. But I understand that authority is currently being challenged in the courts. Specifically, the Third and Seventh Circuits have ruled recently that the FTC cannot obtain monetary relief under Section 13B. And the Third Circuit decided that the FTC misused Section 13B to address past illegal conduct. While we await the Supreme Court's decision, Congress has been asked by the FTC to amend the act to clarify this authority. There is certainly a need to get financial restitution to victims. However, I'm concerned about the potential for the FTC to abuse that authority and use it primarily to leverage defendants into settlements. If the argument in favor of increased FTC authority is that defendants are defending themselves too often without it, it's simply not persuasive. I want to be clear. I understand the importance of Section 13B and the role that it can play in an agency's consumer protection mission. especially in the bigger cases. But I also understand the reality that the Democrats are in the control of both chambers and may want to move before the Supreme Court rules. If that's the case, we must use this time as an opportunity to address other reforms to the commission. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. This is a timely and important discussion, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you.
Introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. There's Bonnie Patton, the Executive Director of truthinadvertising.org. The Honorable William E. Let me say it right. Kovacic, who is global. Let me get this right, okay? Global Competition Professor of Law and Policy, Professor of Law and Director of Competition Law Center at Georgetown University Law School. We have Tracy Ponto, Tracy Canto from Spokane, Cops, Crime Victims Advocate. You heard our ranking member of our full committee talk about her, from Spokane Community Oriented Policing Services. Jessica Rich, Director, Distinguished Fellow at the, I think maybe I could use my glasses here. Let's see. No, not as good. Jessica Rich, I passed her? No, Jessica, Distinguished Fellow at the Institute of Technology Law and Policy at Georgetown Law. Those are our witnesses, and we want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. And so let's begin with Ms. Patton. You are recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Schakowsky, Ranking Member Bilirakis, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of Truth in Advertising, Tina.org, I'm pleased to appear before you to highlight fraudulent and deceptive marketing schemes that have arisen during this unprecedented crisis, and to sound the alarm that the worst may be yet to come if the FTC cannot claw back ill-gotten gains from wrongdoers under Section 13B of the FTC Act. My organization, Tina.org, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit consumer advocacy organization whose mission is to combat deceptive advertising and consumer fraud. We work with businesses and government agencies on behalf of consumers to effectively prevent and stop deception in our economy. There can be no doubt that the ongoing pandemic has exacerbated the ever-present dangers of deceptive and unfair acts and practices in the marketplace. Tina.org has heard from countless consumers, senior citizens, military veterans, and struggling parents whose experiences illustrate the fact that deceptive marketing is putting the health, financial well-being, and safety of our most susceptible populations at risk. The list of deceptively marketed products and services exploiting this pandemic is extensive. CBD products marketed to military veterans as a coronavirus treatment, bleach advertised as a liquid cure-all, wellness centers targeting first responders with IV vitamin drips to protect against COVID-19, Amazon and eBay sellers falsely claiming that their PPE is FDA approved, hand sanitizer marketed as protecting for 24 hours against COVID-19, alleged immunity boosting supplements targeting children, colloidal silver solutions advertised as having the ability to kill the virus from within, toothpaste and teeth whitening products claiming to prevent COVID-19, and sham wellness kits targeting seniors. Unfortunately, the deception does not stop with outrageous health claims. Many are exploiting the economic desperation wrought by this pandemic. Multi-level marketing companies claiming people can earn full-time pay working part-time. Lending companies deceptively using the CARES Act to exploit college students. Investment scams claiming to have patented COVID cures. And financial entities pretending to be SBA authorized lenders to lure in small businesses struggling to keep their workers employed. And to make matters worse, the agency primarily charged with policing these deceptive acts, the FTC, is now at risk of losing a mainstay of its enforcement authority, the ability to make victims whole under Section 13B. Because 13B does not specifically say anything about equitable relief when a permanent injunction is issued, the Supreme Court is now deciding the remedial scope, if any, of 13B in the case AMG versus FTC. AMG was a payday lending scheme that extracted money from people in desperate circumstances. In its appeal, the company does not dispute that it violated the law. Instead, it argues that the $1.3 billion it stole should be its to keep. AMG asserts that it was never Congress's intention for the FTC to return money to victims of fraud under 13B. Quite to the contrary, AMG argues that this legislative body fully endorsed the notion that wrongdoers should pocket the money they've illegally taken when it drafted 13B. If the Supreme Court rules in AMG's favor, and this Congress does not act to empower the FTC to seek restitution under 13B, then the deceptive practices I have enumerated will only multiply. Allowing wrongdoers an absolute right to retain funds under 13B will make consumers and our economy more vulnerable to harm, especially during these unprecedented times. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. And next, we will hear, and thank you so very much for that really compelling testimony. And now let me call on Ms. Ponto. You are recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of Congress. Thank you for inviting me here today to talk to you about our organization and what is happening in the world of scams and frauds over this past 2020 season. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Tracy Ponto. I am a retired Spokane police officer after serving 25 years. I now work full-time as a crime victim advocate for Spokane Community-Oriented Policing Services. Spokane Cops is the nonprofit organization for the Spokane Police Department. We have 5 staff members, 400 volunteers, and 9 cop shops throughout our city. Our cop shops serve as a liaison between the police department and our communities and provide a location for neighbors to come in and seek assistance with their concerns. Our cop shops provide programs such as Block Watch, identity theft and fraud victim callbacks, neighborhood observation patrols, and other programs that work on getting neighbors engaged in their community, working alongside law enforcement, and taking ownership and keeping their community safe. Our organization focuses on crime prevention and working with neighbors to help resolve quality of life issues. In a time where our nation is asking questions on how to get our law enforcement and community working together, our focus is to help educate the community and provide crime prevention tips to help solve many of their concerns. My current position as a crime victim advocate is to help any and all victims of crime. Law enforcement is able to go after the criminals, but who takes care of those that are victimized? Many people feel unsafe after being victimized, and as an advocate, we are able to help restore some of that sense of safety by providing a crime prevention through environmental design survey, amongst other services. When you are a victim of identity theft and fraud, you are incredibly vulnerable to losing your money, which is what supports your daily life. Our advocates' primary goals are to respond to the emotional, psychological, and physical needs of crime victims. We assist victims in stabilizing their lives after victimization and help them understand and participate in the criminal justice system. Our goal is to restore a measure of security and safety for them. In 2020, many victims found themselves losing their employment or working from home. With quarantine and social distancing, victims found themselves doing more of their shopping online. Victim advocates saw an increase in identity theft, fraud, and scams with this vulnerable population. Phishing scams targeted victims by claiming they were trying to process Amazon returns and needed more personal information. Microsoft scams targeted victims using threats of subscription expiring, which would disrupt people trying to work online from home. Unemployment fraud, where databases were hacked, personal information stolen, and fraudulent unemployment claims surfaced. This alone affected thousands of people dependent on supplementing their lost wages. This also created concern from victims that were still employed, yet had claims opened under their names. Now, as we prepare for tax season, we have seen an increase from victims who are receiving paperwork showing unemployment income they were not aware of. With the pandemic, victims that are already feeling isolated and lonely are more vulnerable to phone calls and social media messages that lead to scams. Victims that have been targeted by scammers and have lost money are often too ashamed to tell family members and now have an increased anxiety and fall into despair. Victims do not know where to turn, and the magnitude of these crimes are overwhelming and creating more mental health related issues. COVID set a perfect storm by creating isolation and depression that put people at a higher risk for scams and allowed scammers many different opportunities to prey on this vulnerable audience. As a crime victim advocate, our goal is to provide assistance to our clients and walk them through a step-by-step process of reporting the fraud, gathering evidence to provide their financial institutions and protect them from further identity theft and fraud type crimes. Thank you for your time today.
And thank you, Professor Kovacic. It is yours for 5 minutes. You are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member and members of the committee. I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to participate in these proceedings. I'm going to suggest a series of steps that you and your colleagues can take to put the FTC in a better position to address the formidable challenges that you've mentioned. I acknowledge the wonderful work that I think the FTC has done in a terrible time in which the challenges have intensified and they've had to move out of their building and do everything remotely. I speak from my experience at the FTC and my current work as a non-executive director on the board of the United Kingdom's Competition and Markets Authority. I don't speak on behalf of the agency, but I speak with an awareness of what the CMA, the FTC, and others have done in an extraordinary circumstance when they have had the hardest challenges and have had to work in a remarkably difficult setting. I think they performed admirably. I have some thoughts about what you and your colleagues can do to put them in a position to do still better. Let me start by offering 3 suggestions that involve new legislation, and then to come up with 3 that involve your role as an oversight body and as a forum for holding policy discussions about what the FTC and others should do. First, on the legislative side, I simply echo the priority that all of you have given, that Bonnie Patton has just given as well, to repairing what is likely to be a hole in 13B authority. My own view of the AMG case, which Bonnie just discussed, is that the FTC will lose that case. The oral argument was not favorable from a wide variety of perspectives within the Supreme Court. I think priority number 1 is to be prepared as soon as possible to repair the damage that an adverse decision would do. If the Commission does not have the ability to disgorge ill-gotten gains from misconduct, the deterrent effect of its enforcement power is considerably weakened. That's priority number one. You're aware of that. Second, I would make major new investments in the capability of the Federal Trade Commission. Let's remind ourselves of what Congress has asked it to do. It's not only the principal consumer protection agency in the country, it is a major antitrust agency, and it's the principal US data protection agency. But we pay peanuts to carry out those functions. We pay low salaries compared with even what other federal officials get, and we provide a very modest budget, not even quite $350 million a year. My suggestion, raise the compensation of FTC employees at least to the level of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That salary scale is fully 20% higher. Why and in what respect is financial services consumer protection more important than the concerns we mentioned? Second, and more dramatically, I'd give the FTC $1 billion a year to do its job. I'd monitor the performance with that money, but my view is that we're demanding Mercedes-like performance, but we want to pay for a Chevy instead. And that doesn't happen in real life. I see a real measure of the sincerity of the nation and its elected officials to deliver on this promise, its willingness to fund these activities appropriately. Otherwise, we're just kidding ourselves about what we want to be done. Related to that, major investments in upgrading the FTC system built over a period of 20-25 years to improve its capacity to collect data on misconduct and to apply it, a major upgrade of the Sentinel system, and to mimic the experience of the Competition and Markets Authority to build up a data team. The Competition and Markets Authority has a team of 40 technologists that now work on these issues. Third legislative proposal is to eliminate gaps in the FTC's jurisdiction by eliminating the exceptions for common carriers, banking and financial services, and not-for-profit organizations. Finally, 3 thoughts about the use of oversight authority. One, as the ranking member mentioned, boost cooperation. I suggest to you that taking money away with civil remedies is not going to keep serious bad guys from doing what they do. The only solution there is cooperation with criminal enforcement authorities to take away their freedom. If we're not going to do that, again, I think we're not really digging into the seriousness of the problem and addressing it. Second, invite the FTC and its partners at the state and local level to sit down with you and talk about what they learned by way of doing innovative things to address the COVID crisis and what gaps have to be filled. That should be an ongoing collaboration between the committee and the public enforcement agencies. And last, to confront the future design of the FTC, should you adopt new privacy legislation, what do we want the FTC to do in the future? My thanks to the committee for the chance to be here.
Thank you so much for your testimony. And last but not least, Ms. Rich, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Schakowsky, Ranking Member Bilirakis, and members of this subcommittee. I'm really pleased to be here to discuss the challenges of fighting fraud during the pandemic. I'm no longer at the FTC, but I spent most of my career there, actually 26 years, the last 4 of those years as its Director of Consumer Protection. I care deeply about ensuring a safe and fair marketplace for the American public. One of the biggest challenges in consumer protection, as we've all been talking about here today, is fighting fraud, a pernicious problem that steals from consumers, often those least able to afford it, undermines their trust, and distorts the functioning of the marketplace. In times of crisis, fraud can be especially relentless. Con artists prey on distressed consumers, offering bogus health cures, non-existent financial aid, and many other scams, often posing as a government agency or official. This happened with Hurricane Katrina and the Great Recession, and it's happening now. Over the past year, the FTC has received many consumer complaints related to COVID-19 and has responded with consumer alerts, warning letters to scammers, and law enforcement. As of December, thanks to the leadership of this committee, the FTC can now impose fines on the scams perpetrators. However, the FTC is facing serious challenges in its broader fight against fraud, which is the focus of my testimony today. In my written testimony, I flagged 4 issues. First is the FTC's authority to obtain restitution under 13B of the FTC Act. As everybody has discussed extensively today, it is under risk. For over 40 years, the FTC has used Section 13B to return many billions of dollars to consumers and small businesses victimized by fraud and deception. Until recently, every circuit court to consider the issue held that the FTC could do so. Notably, 13B is the only provision in the law that has enabled the FTC to seek in the same action both an injunction against FTC Act violations and restitution for consumers. The adverse rulings in the circuit courts have already undermined the FTC's ability to obtain restitution in those circuits. An adverse ruling in the Supreme Court would be devastating. Section 13B is simply the most efficient and effective tool that the FTC has to stop illegal conduct, prevent defendants from profiting from it, and return money to consumers. Without it, the FTC has to engage in either a cumbersome two-step process with two separate back-to-back lawsuits, or limit restitution to those situations where it's enforcing a rule, which is a subset of cases. These options will severely hinder the FTC's ability to get money back to consumers. And I hope that Congress will restore the authority to do that the FTC has been using for over 40 years. The second issue I flagged is the ability of the FTC and others to hold accountable the entities that enable frauds to thrive, including the platforms through which scammers disseminate fraudulent information. At the FTC and elsewhere, defendants of all types argue they're immune from liability under Section 230, often forcing protracted litigation to resolve the issue. Although 230 reform is complex and beyond the scope of this hearing, there may be other measures like last year's Informed Consumers Act that could create much needed accountability short of wholesale 230 reform. Third, fraud can have a disproportionate impact on certain communities, such as seniors, veterans, African Americans, and Latinos. During my tenure at the FTC, we created an ambitious outreach and research initiative called Every Community, the goal of which was to ensure that the FTC was reaching and protecting the diverse communities victimized by fraud. The FTC should scale up this program again now, including by collecting more data with appropriate safeguards to enable a broader examination of whether the FTC is reaching different communities. Also, it should consider hiring experts on racial equity and representation to assist with this effort. Finally, the FTC needs stronger authority to protect consumers' privacy, including the ability to seek penalties for first-time violations. One lesson of the pandemic was that Americans refused to use contact tracing apps, which could have been helpful to track the disease, largely due to concerns that the data wouldn't be protected from misuse. This subcommittee has shown very strong support for privacy legislation in the past, and I hope that will continue. Thank you again for allowing me to be here today.
Well, thank you so much. The gentlewoman yields back, and let me now we have concluded the witness opening statements. At this time, we'll move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask a question and get an answer of our witnesses. And I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. So we certainly have talked a lot about 13B and the importance of that. I want to thank Representative Cardenas for your leadership on this, on addressing this this issue. And I want to say that I hope that every single member of this subcommittee can agree that scammers should not get to keep the money that they stole from consumers, which is essentially what would happen if we were to get rid of 13B. So Ms. Patton, I noticed that you filed an amicus brief urging the Supreme Court to uphold the FTC's ability to seek restitution. And as you may know, the Attorney General from the state of Illinois, Attorney General Kwame Raoul, has a bipartisan coalition now of 30 state attorneys general, who are also filing an amicus brief in support. I wondered if there's anything, I know you spoke about it, but if there's anything else that you want to say that we should know and care about when it comes to protecting this very important tool.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The amici brief from the states in the District of Columbia made clear that states absolutely need the FTC to have 13B authority. States do not have nationwide jurisdiction over these scams. They can't go into foreign countries easily. So if the FTC cannot claw back ill-gotten gains through 13B, then the states will be required to shift resources over to trying to make victims whole. One of the things that I thought was so telling in the amici brief was that they said between 2016 and 2019, the FTC returned more than $10 billion to 9 million consumers in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, in Puerto Rico. And then if the FTC loses 13B, you can be guaranteed that consumers in every single state will be faced with more deceptive acts and practices.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Ms. Rich, Mr. Kovacic. Here's a really important question. Is there any point in waiting to see how the Supreme Court rules on the question of 13B, or should the authority under that, should we deal with it before the Supreme Court? Mr. Kovacic? Was I on mute?
My own intuition would be to wait until the decision comes up. There's the possibility there's the possibility that the court will say, contrary to my prediction, the FTC is doing a great job. That's just what Congress wanted, full speed ahead. I'd be faintly concerned that if there were a measure introduced and adopted before that, the argument could be made, or the impression given, that, oh my God, Congress didn't think that that the Commission has the authority, so it's got to put in a supporting mechanism right now. I guess my inclination would be, but you understand the legislative process better than I do, how long it takes and how it goes. My inclination would be to drop that bill as fast as possible, or even now to be ready if there's an adverse decision. But I hope I'm wrong. Maybe the Supreme Court says, God bless the FTC, full speed ahead.
So let me ask Ms. Rich, or anyone else who wants to weigh in on this. Go ahead.
I would love to just state a contrary view, which is that, as I understand it, the FTC already cannot pursue restitution under 13B in 2 circuits, and in other circuits now defendants are saying, dragging their feet, delaying, saying you don't have the authority, and these are defendants that have wrongly taken money from consumers. And so the FTC is limited now, and I would encourage Congress to take action now, because it's already a problem. And I too have been following the arguments in the Supreme Court, and I'm not optimistic, but regardless, it's already a problem.
So although I'm out of time, I just want to ask Ms. Patton, yes or no, should we move now or wait for the Supreme Court?
I think you should absolutely move now to protect 320 US consumers and honest and fair businesses. They deserve that protection now.
Thank you. Well, this is a very important decision for us to consider as a subcommittee and as a full committee. So we'll get to it. And now I will recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Bilirakis, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate it. I thank the panel for their testimony today. Very informative. Recently, constituents in my district have been targeted by scammers promising COVID-19 vaccinations. I mentioned that in my opening comments. Thank Eventbrite websites masking themselves as health departments are requiring residents to pay fees for appointments to receive the vaccination. This was reported in my local paper, the Tampa Bay Times, recently. I'm glad to hear steps have been taken to remedy this particular situation, but more needs to be done to protect the vulnerable individuals trying to receive the vaccinations. I think most people would agree with that. Ms. Ponto, how can we better educate individuals on vaccination scams? And then should local health departments around the country work with community organizers and law enforcement agencies? If yes, what should they collaborate on? I know you mentioned this. I believe you mentioned that you touched on this. Can you elaborate a little more?
Thank you. We have not actually seen a lot of scams in regards to vaccinations and PPEs and other things in our community. Because we're so well based and have our shops, we actually filter a lot of what's happening out there into our shops and thus into our COPS program. We do have a health district that is down around our police station, and they are pretty good at educating folks about what is going on and staying up on that population. What I am concerned about is definitely our elderly who are sitting at home and isolated and scared and might be more susceptible to that social media or those phone calls and fall prey to this. Education, again, is the way to go. And for us, it's getting it out there, making our phone calls to our community members. Our neighborhood councils are also very successful of getting out the information, and then getting our city council involved as well, just to get it out. And that's on our level citywide. Thank
What
you.
about working with law enforcement? Do you recommend that as well?
I always recommend working with law enforcement, and law enforcement is my background, so any way that we can pull them in and work with them and not have them do our work for us is a win-win in my books. So what does that look like? Not exactly sure, but we are community-oriented policing, and so we kind of are setting in the nation. We have other cities that come to see our programs and why it works so well for our city. Volunteers and the community is where it's at, and we get to work alongside with our law enforcement.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Rich, in your testimony, you mentioned the findings of every community, quote unquote. An FTC program you worked on, which highlighted that the underserved communities impacted by scams are not reporting them as often as they should. Can you explain why it is important that every scam should be reported? And then I have a question for Ms. Ponto. Why should every scam be reported?
The FTC really does relies on many sources for targeting its law enforcement, but one of the sources is consumer complaints that it receives, and also information it receives from its partner about the complaints they're seeing on the ground. So if the inputs if the agency isn't getting information about the scams that are really hurting consumers, it can't target its enforcement well. And if certain communities aren't comfortable reporting to the FTC or don't know to report to the FTC may not be protecting those communities. And research that we did when I was still at the FTC suggests that was the case in some instances. And so it's very, very important that the FTC do more work to ensure that it is reaching every community that needs its protection, whether by itself or through trusted partners, so that it can target its protection efforts effectively.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to go ahead and yield back because my time has expired, but I'll submit questions for the record. Thank you.
I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Schakowsky. I wanted to ask some questions. I wanted to use New Jersey, if I could, as an example, because we've had a very aggressive state attorney general who's been trying to go against consumer protection violations. But even so, since the beginning of the pandemic, New Jersey has lost nearly $9 million, individuals in fraud, despite this aggressive enforcement by the attorney general, and that includes he's sent out like 1,800 cease and desist letters and at least a dozen enforcement actions. And of course, I'm proud of the fact that we did a bipartisan initiative in the end of the year package to include, this provision that gives the FTC new authority to seek civil penalties for scams and deceptive practices related to COVID. That I believe was Jan and Dr. Bouchon's initiative. And the FTC has issued more than 500 warning letters to sellers of unapproved or misbranded products related to COVID. So let me just ask quickly, because there's not a lot of time, obviously. Ms. Patton, are warning letters enough to protect consumers from fraud and scams?
Unfortunately not. I think the one common theme with every scam we are going to talk about today is that they are perpetrated for financial gain. And unless the money is taken out of the pockets of wrongdoers, it will always be in their interest to continue. So a warning letter, regardless of where it comes from, is just not going to deter criminals.
Well, thank you. So let me ask Ms. Rich, how could the FTC use the new authority from the COVID-19 Consumer Protection Act to fight fraud and scams more effectively? If you could, quickly. I hate to say quickly, but.
The new law covers a huge amount of scams. It's very broad as to COVID scams. And so if a company engages in any of that activity, the FTC can pursue civil penalties. So just as Ms. Patton just said, it is very important for deterrence to make it painful for fraudsters to rip off consumers. And so the civil penalty authority is very.
Well, let me ask this. I mentioned today about the Supreme Court and the threat to the FTC's 13B authority, restitution, and Tony has a bill to deal with that. But now that the FTC has this authority to fine companies who've committed fraud and scams related to the pandemic under this new law, why is it still important to ensure that the FTC's 13B authority is preserved? Why is that still important, Mr. Rich?
COVID scams are terrible, but they're one of many frauds that the FTC has to fight all year long, in and out of a pandemic. So in many of those cases, the FTC doesn't have civil penalty authority and its redress authority is under threat. So it's a much broader problem that goes beyond the COVID scams that are occurring here. And so it still needs to be fixed.
All right. And then just quickly on social media for Ms. Patton or Ms. Rich, we know that, the scams on social media have tripled this year, mostly with online shopping. And earlier this week, Jan, myself, Anna Eshu, Mike Doyle sent a letter to Facebook, Twitter, and Google regarding their handling of COVID vaccine misinformation and how it's escalated on their platforms. And obviously, I'm concerned about that. So, Ms. Patton, can you talk more about why it's so easy for consumers to be duped by ads they see on social media? And then I could ask both of you, what are some things the FTC could be doing to help prevent those types of social media scams in the time left? I'll start with Ms. Patton.
Thank you. Social media is incredibly effective at persuading consumers to believe what they're seeing because they're following people they believe in or they want to emulate. So it's one of the most effective tools scammers have to be able to get to consumers because there's honest and trustworthy belief by consumers.
So what do you suggest between you and Ms. Rich about the things that FTC can do to help prevent these scams on social media? Just briefly, if you could.
I'll defer to Ms. Rich.
Well, obviously the FTC should keep doing warning letters and take action wherever possible using its new authority. But there's a huge role for education here and for the FTC working with the groups that consumers trust to get the word out. People trust information that comes from their community groups, their church, et cetera, their local groups. So the FTC really has to be aggressive about education. I don't know whether the FTC is amplifying its own messages on social media. If not, it should be doing that. And of course, the FTC should be pressing the platform strongly to take their own action. But as you know, 230 is a problem in terms of the FTC actually taking action against the platforms.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you. And now I recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And before I move to questioning, I just want to emphasize the importance of Section 13B and the role that it plays and has played and will continue to play in the FTC's consumer protection mission, and especially with the bigger cases. I think we also need to recognize as these cases are moving up to the Supreme Court and we are anticipating a decision, as we move forward, due process is a fundamental principle for the protection of Americans' legal rights, and it must be central to any changes to existing law. If we're to tackle 13B authorities, we should also take a holistic view, I believe, of FTC's authorities and consider other amendments. We considered FTC process and transparency reforms in the 114th Congress, and I would just recommend them to you, Madam Chair, and other members of this committee, that as we're moving forward looking at FTC roles and responsibilities, that what was put together then be a part of this legislative effort. With that, I'd like to start with Ms. Ponto from Spokane, Washington, and just thank you for your excellent testimony today. I thought it was really helpful to be able to hear from somebody who's on the front lines, really trying to help so many in our community that are being impacted by various scams. You know, we're talking a lot about the FTC and its statute and authorities, but I also think it's also important just for us to better understand, you know, why people are falling for these scams and why they're vulnerable now and how we can improve education to prevent scams and facilitate cooperation among the federal, state, and local agencies. So in that vein, Ms. Ponto, I just wanted you to speak to the type of scams that you're seeing for the most part, whether they're directly tied to COVID or if other things are also on your radar screen, perhaps a cure scam or a treatment scam, or are consumers just more vulnerable in general because they're shut in and are more likely to be tricked by scammers calling their home phone during COVID?
Thank you. Absolutely. With the isolation and people being locked up and quarantined, that's the number one complaint that I'm seeing coming through our office is that they're lonely. And these scammers are targeting folks. I had an elderly lady who bought an iPad, and somehow she got a scammer telling her that he sees 29 hacks on her iPad. And, you know, she's in her 70s and she's thinking, okay, this gentleman's nice, sounds nice. He's going to help me fix this. Broken English, accent, you know, but she didn't see those flags. And basically, long story short, he had her in the car, tripping around to Fred Meyer's and Target, pulling gift cards, putting $500 to $1,000 on gift cards, walking her through the process of going through different check stands, getting them cash. Had a store manager come up, recognize that she may have been a victim of fraud. She lied to him. She goes, Tracy, I knew that he was telling me, and I still lied to him. This scammer stayed on the phone with her while she did all of this, while she drove to the stores, picked up the gift cards, went through the different check stands, went back out to her car, scratched off the numbers and read the numbers to him. He called her 12 times a day when she wouldn't pick up the phone. He claimed that he got control of her Nest camera and was able to look into the house because he was concerned for her. And so when you're talking about these kinds of things, whether some of this happened or not, it absolutely is scary. The way that it came about was that her daughter was flying up here for the holidays and the credit card was declined. As soon as she saw it, and mom didn't tell her daughter because she was embarrassed. These are stories that we're seeing over and over and over again. The newest thing now with Washington State auditors, with this big, massive breach that is just coming about, worries me that I'm going to have tons of victims in my office that were victims with the Employment Security Department breach we saw this spring. So we need help. I've got detectives who are having difficult times pulling information for victims, even though the FTC says that, you know, these businesses shall provide this information. It's taking months to get it. And so we need better, thorough, more timely help from the Federal Trade Commission in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for what you're doing on the front lines and joining us today. I yield back.
Well, those are amazing, amazing stories. Now, I am happy to call on my dear friend and fellow Illinoisan and longtime member of this committee, Congressman Bobby Rush. Bob, can you unmute? Bobby Rush, unmute. There we go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I am your friend, and we have been friends for decades now, and I certainly enjoy your friendship. Mr. Rich, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the healthcare disparities in our nation, and parallel to this pandemic is what I call a consumer protection pandemic that is more long-standing and that has existed for many multiple decades in our nation. In your testimony, you mentioned that the rulings on 13B by the Third and Seventh Circuits, and I quote, have already undermined the FTC's ability to obtain restitution for consumers. My district is in the heart of the Seventh Circuit, and I would ask you if you would please drill down for us and to describe how these rulings have undermined the FTC's ability to obtain restitution, and how have this impacted communities, consumers in these circuits?
Well, I'm not at the FTC now, so I don't have the details of the cases and that have been stopped or changed because of the rulings. But when the circuit court says that you can't get restitution through 13B, until that's reversed, whether by a miracle at the Supreme Court or by Congress acting, the FTC cannot bring a 13B action and in one action both get injunctive relief against law violations, often fraud, and restitution at the same time. Instead, it has to instead it would have to sue that company if it wants to get restitution in an administrative action that takes years at the commission. And then when that is done and there is an order, go to court in the Seventh Circuit in your district and seek redress then. In cases where the FTC has used this tool, it has taken years and years, and the money, there's no guarantee the money will be there at the end of it, allowing defendants to keep the money. The other alternative is that if there is a rule on the books that the FTC can enforce, then it can go to the Seventh Circuit and seek restitution in the same action where it's stopping the conduct. But many cases that the FTC brings don't involve rule violations. And so that's a problem as well. And so you're putting your finger on the very heart of the problem.
Thank you. Ms. Patton, can you please discuss what reforms you think are needed to Section 230? And specifically, why should the Congress exclude commercial speech from the protections Section 230 currently affords?
Thank you. I don't think that deceptive and false speech that's commercial in nature, and I want to stress commercial speech, should be protected. That is the kind of speech that is being used to take advantage of susceptible and vulnerable populations, especially during this pandemic, to steal money from them, steal their identities. And it does more than just economically impact these people. It really goes to, as we've talked about, people's mental health care and the like. And so I just don't think that there should be a law protecting that kind of illegal speech.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
And now, thank you for your questions and answers. And let me now call on everybody's friend and a one-time chairman of this committee, Congressman Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a very important hearing, and I really appreciate listening in and participating with all of my colleagues. This is so important because so often this really does prey on the most vulnerable, those that are least prepared to deal with something like this. And we've seen it on other issues. Traditionally, I've been kidnapped. Please send money to pay my hotel bill, and it goes to Nigeria and it disappears. But this is even worse because all of us know about COVID, and all of us want a resolve to this issue so that we can get our life back to normal again. And these folks who are praying with an EY versus AY are so dangerous to our society. Let me just say a couple things from Michigan's perspective. We know that there have been already contacting our offices, our state offices, more than almost 4,600 cases of fraud have already been identified. Another almost 2,600 scams, identity theft, almost 1,300. Do not call, 331. Almost $6 million total, with an average of $250 per individual, and the percentage of reports indicating a loss, 44%. So a real issue. I guess my first question is to Mr. Kovacic. What is your understanding as it relates to Section 13B and Section 19? Are they mutually exclusive? What are your thoughts on that issue?
They're complementary mechanisms, but Jessica has underscored the superior quality of Section 13B. It provides by far a more effective way of getting the kind of immediate relief, getting a temporary restraining order right away, freezing assets, making it possible to preserve the possibility for recovery. The Commission does have other tools, but in the context we're describing, especially with the urgency that you've just set out, 13B is the best mechanism the Commission has to get immediate effective relief. But part of what I find disheartening about our conversation is notice how often we've heard the word crime and criminals mentioned here. My concern is that if there's not an effective collaborative mechanism between the civil enforcement side and criminal enforcement officials, if that's not a priority, what we've really said is that the worst that will happen to you is you'll have to give the money back. And I think the only way to have the real deterrent message here is to take away the freedom of the criminals we've been talking about. But 13B, for getting the civil recovery in place, by far superior to the other tools the FTC has.
Well, thank you. Ms. Ponto, you know, in your previously service in law enforcement before joining the Spokane cops, how can law enforcement be better equipped to go after scammers? I know social media is used. I look at my relationship with my law enforcement folks, and they're often the ones that are going knocking on the doors, trying to help individuals who might have been victims of scams. But how did you work and enlist social media to try and bring about the knowledge and education to folks as relates to potential scams in your previous role?
Thank you. Backing up just a little bit, with our department, I think it's important to know that, you know, fraud is not necessarily a glamorous crime. Most of our crimes that we investigated that took higher priority are the crimes against persons. And, you know, identity theft and fraud is a property crime. It also has multiple layers to it. And I know as a patrol officer, you know, we would hand off to go to domestic violences and big assaults. But you had somebody that was at a Safeway with identity theft, you know, it was like, oh my God, I'm not even sure if I know how to do this. There's so many layers to identity theft and fraud that when we would take the report, then we would pass it off to the detectives to do the investigations. Well, about 10 years ago, our fraud unit was dissolved. We needed more detectives in different areas of Spokane. And so they kind of farmed out the fraud cases to those detectives that were already carrying a large caseload. And so I think that is detrimental in itself because we don't have folks that are doing that specifically. And I see my time is just about up. So, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. And now I recognize Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes of questions. I skipped someone? Yeah. Oh, you know what? Excuse me. Sorry. I'm so sorry. I skipped a couple of people. Wow. Okay. Oh, no, Ms. Castor, you are next. Sorry.
Great. Thanks, Chairwoman Schakowsky. This is a very important hearing. And let me start by congratulating my good friend and neighbor, Gus Bilirakis. Ranking Member Bilirakis has a great ring to it. And I know Rep. Soto would agree that when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers win the Super Bowl this Sunday, it will not be a scam. It may be hard to believe, it may be a miracle, but no scam at issue here. But this is a really good place for the subcommittee to start because we're talking about the fundamental authorities of the Federal Trade Commission and whether or not the FTC is really working at its full capacity for our neighbors. And unfortunately, in many cases, it is not. And it couldn't be more obvious than during this pandemic when folks are desperate and they don't know who to trust from day to day. And as our witnesses have pointed out, it's just the scams are widespread. Unfortunately, the scam artists are all too creative these days. And back home in Tampa, I've heard from my neighbors about fake COVID cures and phony clinical studies and even the puppy and romance scams. And unfortunately, the FTC has been ineffective because they're required to send these toothless warning letters to law-breaking companies, and that's just not going to cut it anymore, in my opinion. So, Ms. Rich, you've been at this for many years. In your testimony, you point out that the FTC lacks the authority to impose that first offense civil penalty. Explain to us how this is harmful to the FTC efforts to go after deceptive companies, and do you think it's emboldening companies to proceed with these deceptive practices?
As some of my co-panelists and many of the representatives the members have said, it's very important to have appropriate remedies to deter wrongdoing and also to, where possible, return money to consumers. The FTC's first choice of remedy is always to return money to consumers, not penalties. But you can't always return money to consumers, and as we've been discussing, that authority is under threat. And one of the reasons you can't always return money to consumers is you can't find the consumers, there's not enough to implement a meaningful redress program, et cetera. So in some instances, civil penalty authority is better than redress authority. And for example, in many of these types of scams where it's against a small fly-by-night company. So the FTC needs all of these monetary remedies in order to provide meaningful deterrence. And it lacks them across a lot of its programs.
And Ms. Patton, do you agree?
Absolutely. I think we can look at the Amazon case that was mentioned earlier to think that this giant company that makes billions of dollars every year had to steal $60 million of tips from its drivers. And all the FTC could do in that case was get the money back. They couldn't penalize Amazon. And I just think that's crazy. It's outrageous. And I think that Amazon absolutely deserved a penalty.
Well, I think it's clear that, especially with the evolution of online platforms, these scam artists are just, the scams have accelerated. The online platforms have facilitated it. And I think this committee will have an obligation to modernize the FTC and address the first offense civil penalties and the ability to use and reinforce Section 13B going forward. So I'll look forward to working with all of my colleagues here to do just that. And thanks, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now I recognize Mr. Latta for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, I thank the chair and also to our witnesses today for appearing for us virtually. Before I begin with my questions, I'd like to briefly touch on how important the important access to the WHOIS information is to this discussion. In short, WHOIS information is like the public lands record for the internet. It tells us who is responsible for a domain name or an IP address. This data can be incredibly helpful for federal agencies and law enforcement when investigating crimes and even consumer scams. Unfortunately, due to an overly broad interpretation of the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, WHOIS information is no longer made widely available for public access. Last year, I sent a letter to the Federal Trade Commission asking how they use WHOIS to stop consumer fraud related to COVID-19. The FTC made it clear in the response that since the implementation of GDPR, they can no longer quickly and easily obtain the information they need to combat fraud. This has been particularly harmful during the COVID-19 pandemic, as the FTC works to monitor the marketplace for unsubstantiated health claims, robocall scams, and other deceptive practices. To effectively combat consumer scams, we need to develop a solution that allows our federal agencies to access WHOIS. I appreciate that the Internet Corporation for Assignment of Names and Numbers, ICANN, recognizes the importance of WHOIS and is working to find a pathway that provides this data for legitimate, lawful needs, but is taking far too long to make this information accessible. As we discuss COVID-19 scams today, I asked my colleagues on this committee to consider how helpful WHOIS information would be to stop criminal schemes and to work with me to fix this issue. I asked the chair unanimous consent to enter into the record the written response I received from the FTC on July the 30th of 2020. Getting to the questions, through the course of the pandemic, scammers have preyed upon Americans' concerns about the COVID-19 virus. We've seen this through phone calls, social media posts, phishing schemes, and counterfeit products. Senior citizens, especially those in Ohio, were hit hard by these scams. And just a short period of time, 578 scams targeted individuals 60 and older. Most recently, my district county health departments have been warning citizens of scammers pretending to be health department officials. These bad actors are telling residents about coronavirus test results, contact tracing, and vaccine scheduling, and asking for personal information such as credit card numbers and social security numbers. So, Ms. Ponto, if I could start my first question with you. While we know that the FTC is taking action against many scammers who are using the pandemic to defraud consumers, how are law enforcement agencies taking action at the local level? And how can we better, again, I know you've brought it up a couple of times, but how can we better educate our consumers, especially our seniors, to identify these potential scams?
Thank you. Before COVID, we were able to do a lot of our tablings. We had town hall meetings. Now we do everything by Zoom, much like what we're doing here today. We are still getting that information out in those forums. We divvy that information out to our neighborhood councils, to our city councils, who have their own social media platforms. Our COPS program is very good. Again, we're all situated in the different neighborhoods, and a lot of that comes filtered through our COP shops. We have pamphlets, we do the brochures, and we're able to talk to people on the phone. We have all kinds of elderly folks who give us a call to confirm that the police organization is giving us a call and they want money for their emergency fund. Is this a scam, or do I give them money? We're able to talk them through these things. We will continue to educate in these different platforms the best that we can, but really the COP shops is a great alternative for being right there in the neighborhood and serving that liaison between the police department and the community.
Well, also your testimony, you talk about the unemployment scams, and that a lot of people don't realize their information is being used for fraudulent unemployment claims until much later. Are there systems in place to help these individuals to further protect their information or recover from this stuff?
At this time, I do not believe so, but I'm not confident on that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And Madam Chair, my time has expired and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. And next we have Congressman McNerney for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, I thank the chair for holding this hearing and the ranking member. Good luck with the Buccaneers this Sunday, Gus, but I don't think you're going to win it. I want to thank the witnesses. Your testimony has been very stark and effective, and it will motivate us, I think, into action. So it's a very good hearing in that regard. As already noted here, we've seen a sharp increase during the pandemic in scammers targeting unemployment benefits. And in recent years, we've also seen numerous data breaches where consumers' personal information was stolen. Ms. Rich, how do these pervasive data breaches increase the risks that consumers' information can be used to target the consumers later on, like going after their unemployment benefits?
The data breaches are very harmful. The whole purpose of a data breach is usually to steal consumers' information so it can be used to rip them off at later times. If you don't get financial information enough to directly defraud consumers, they can use the information they obtain for phishing. They know something about the consumer, so they can then send them emails about that look authentic, come from some place the consumer's expecting to get an email, and then get more information from them. So data breaches are very harmful, and that's an area where I'm hopeful Congress will act to give the FTC more authority to take action.
Good, that's a great segue to my next question to you, Ms. Rich. What additional tools and resources does the Federal Trade Commission need to help stop these breaches from happening in the first place?
A special law authorizing the FTC in particular, not just to address breaches, but to address the underlying poor security that causes these breaches. And it would be very important to give the FTC civil penalties for first violations as part of this law, which, as we've discussed, it lacks. And as Professor Kovacic discussed, to fill in some of the gaps in jurisdiction that the FTC has, for example, common carriers, telecom companies, and nonprofits. So that's an area that Congress can really make a difference.
Well, thank you. I'm also concerned that once consumers fall victim to identity theft, they aren't getting the help they need to clean up their data and prevent the same thing from happening repeatedly to them. Ms. Rich, do you think more cooperation is needed from all stakeholders involved in helping consumers in such cases, including consumer reporting agencies?
Yes, this is a real problem. And as Ms. Ponto discussed, I think she talked about local police not necessarily taking the action they need to follow up on identity theft schemes. So it involves the credit reporting agencies, it involves the FTC referring complaints, and it involves local law enforcement, and they all really need to step up.
Thank you. Well, my district includes the city of Stockton, California. It's perhaps the most racially and ethnically diverse city in the country, but it also has a large low-income population. Many folks are just struggling to put food on their table and pay their bills. Ms. Rich, do you think more outreach needs to be done to help consumers who fall victim to identity theft in communities like Stockton, and what could the FTC be doing to help, to be more helpful?
The FTC's strategy has been to try to partner with trusted sources of information in various communities, but I don't know how successful it's been in your community. I don't know whether FTC has been able to invest the resources it needs to really reach out and partner with those communities. But that's the strategy I know it's tried to use, and it even encourages local enforcement to rebrand FTC materials so that they can be trusted materials. So that's a very important thing the FTC needs to continue to do.
Well, my last comment is about price gouging. Many of my constituents have raised concerns about price gouging during the pandemic. I'm sure everyone on the dais has had the same issue. I think it's important that we pass strong federal legislation like HR 675 to protect consumers against these practices. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and now I call on Mr. Guthrie.
It was strong.
It was a really good exchange.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate you and Republican leader Bill Rackus for holding this hearing, and thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began nearly a year ago, deceptive marketing, counterfeit products, and scammers targeting America's most vulnerable have been on the rise. In order to help protect Americans and stop this trend, I introduced my bill, the Safeguarding Therapeutics Act, worked with our former colleague, Elliot Engel. Hope he is doing well. It was signed into law last month. This legislation gives the FDA the authority to seize and destroy counterfeit medical devices and products, such as counterfeit vaccines and other combination devices that could harm patients. So proud that that was signed before last session. So my question is starting with Ms. Patton. In your testimony, you mentioned multiple misleading health products, such as unapproved treatments and cures for the coronavirus that are continually advertised to susceptible populations across the country. So my question is, how is the truthinadvertising.org, how does it successfully work with businesses and government agencies to combat fraudulent marketing schemes, to protect these consumers from these harmful products? And what resources are available to help consumers identify these products?
Thank you. So one of our goals is to always get information to consumers as quickly as possible. So we immediately put things on our website, tina.org, and on social media platforms to try and educate consumers about inappropriate health products. Moreover, when we do find a company that is violating the law, FTC law, we'll immediately contact the company and ask them to stop it. Sometimes we find that we are educating the uneducated and that they just don't know better. And in other instances where we're either ignored or we feel that they've not done a good job, we will not hesitate to go to state and federal agencies to try and stop the inappropriate health claims from being marketed.
Okay, thanks. And does Tina.org have the resources to help these consumers?
We try and do as much as we can. We're a small organization, but we have thousands of posts on our website, a lot of them dealing with the wellness industry and inappropriate health claims. And we try and guide consumers to where they can get help at the local, state, and federal level when appropriate.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I'll switch to Ms. Ponto. Can you explain how your organization assists victims of scams? And do you direct victims to file complaints with the FTC or any law enforcement agencies? And if so, can you walk us through the process once a report is filed?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So we end up getting, well, and we've been in a proactive active manner. We have this vehicle prowling victim callbacks where we get these daily reports from the police department that talk about victims who have been prowled. Maybe their purse was stolen, maybe credit cards were stolen. Our cop shops do these callbacks, and so we're very proactive. We reach out to the folks and find out, do you have any personal identification in there at all that would lead to identity theft? If they do, we have been following this recovery plan very well. This is a wonderful source of information for us. One thing that I did notice, though, is some of these larger banks and corporations, when they are talking to the victim, who usually go to their bank first to say, hey, I'm a victim of fraud, to see what they need to do next, the banks have been pretty good about starting that fraud alert. And that's what we would say is, let's go ahead and get a fraud alert started for you. The larger banks are not, I'm not hearing anyone that says from the larger banks are telling them to go to the FTC and file a report. And that's really odd to me. We do. I ask them, you know, this might be a new phone number that they don't have, or at least updates the phone number that it's most currently used. But we got to get it in there because just like report writing, if it's not down in a report, it didn't happen. And so we need all of these to go through the FTC just so that you have that information and that you can get it out there to other potential.
Okay. Thank you to both of you.
My time's about security numbers. We point them in that direction there, and start really following this Bible right here as far as helping our victims. So thank you for this. This is a beautiful piece of work. I have it framed in my office.
Well, thank you. My time's expired. I appreciate your answers, and I yield back after that.
I thank the gentleman, and now I recognize Mr. Cardenas for his 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Tracy, for expressing how you put your heart and soul into your work and for framing that document. It's very concerning to me that we hear these stories over and over, and during the worst pandemic we've seen in over 100 years, it appears that over hundreds of millions of dollars have been stolen from Americans. And it's very important for us to understand that this is not a nebulous thing. This is going on every day and affecting the most vulnerable people in our community. For example, grandparents being told that their Social Security payments will be withheld if they don't make an urgent payment. They're your neighbor who is struggling to get consistent work because of the pandemic, and they've lost their job and they fall into this fraudulent investment coaching scam. For years, the FTC has sent a strong message to people who would prey on consumers to make money off of people illegally. And the message is simply this: you will face consequences and you will be held accountable and you will pay. Now more than ever, it's critical that we ensure that the FTC has the tools it needs to continue doing its job in protecting American consumers. Jessica, I'm sorry, Ms. Ridge, during the past year, consumers reported losing more than $300 million to fraudulent activities related to the pandemic. In general, how often is the FTC able to recover money lost to fraud and scams?
I don't know that I could put a particular number on it, but whenever the FTC takes actions, its goal is to get money back for consumers. That is the top priority, which is why the 13B threat is so urgent, and why I'm sure everybody at the FTC watching this hearing right now is very thankful to you for taking the leadership to try to solve that issue. But that is the top goal. Frequently, the money's gone, and that will be more and more the case if this authority it goes away.
Yes, and thank you. Yes, 13B is critical, and I hope that we can legislatively put that right once and for all. Is it fair to say that bad actors who are taking advantage of people with these schemes related to pandemic would be emboldened should the FTC lose its power to return the money back to the American people when they've been scammed?
They already are. As I mentioned, the FTC can't pursue this relief in 2 circuits already, and others are watching that and saying, oh, look, the Supreme Court may take this authority away. Let's delay, or let's not pay. And as we also discussed, the FTC lacks civil penalty authority in many cases. And so between the 2 of those, it's going to embolden fraudsters a lot.
Okay, thank you. Bill, Mr. Kovacic, as a former small business owner myself, I know that it's even hard to run a business even in the best of times. The overwhelming majority of small business owners are honest Americans who want to do things the right way. How are small businesses who are playing by the rules harmed when they have to compete in a marketplace with actors who break the rules and who are not brought to justice? Why is Section 13B so important to the FTC's work to make sure that we have a fair playing field out there?
I think, as we're all painfully aware, the businesses you're talking about already are suffering a horrible period of distress. And there's a good question about how many of them will survive this process. In your own district, how many small businesses that were fully operational 12 months ago will be operational 12 months hence? And my guess is the denominator is a lot bigger than the numerator there. You add to that the additional concern that I play by the rules. I pay my employees fairly. I give my customers a fair deal. I think one of the most damaging things is that when you have the bad guys, and again, these are cynical bad guys, it gives the sense that the whole neighborhood of commerce is corrupt. It creates a sense of doubt about the legitimacy of other transactions. That is, if I'm the hardworking small businessman you described, how do I persuade people that I'm clean? So one taint of this process is that it raises questions about the legitimacy of the entire market system. But the other is that it can give advantages to individuals in the short term that diverts trade away from people who are playing by the rules. So it's in addition to this horrible scourge that small businesses face now, you see a diversion of trade away, you see a loss of confidence, and you see the possibility that people just don't trust the market.
Thank you, Mr. Kovacic. My time has expired, and we are a country of laws, and the FTC needs to be able to do its part, and hopefully we as Congress will restore that clearly. Thank you so much. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And now I want to welcome Mr. Bouchon for his time and just say we were able to pass at least a first step, the COVID-19 Consumer Protection Act, but obviously we've learned today we have to do much more. So Mr. Bouchon, it's yours.
Thank you, Chair Schakowsky, for holding this very important hearing. It's, I think, sometimes you have hearings in Congress that don't get a lot of media attention. I hope this one does, because the level of scams that are out there has probably grown exponentially during COVID-19, shamefully, unfortunately. So this is an important hearing. I was proud to work alongside you, Chair Schakowsky, to help introduce and include the COVID-19 Consumer Protection Act in the end of the year funding bill to put real teeth behind the FTC's enforcement efforts in combating COVID-19 scams by allowing them to seek civil penalties for first-time offenders throughout the duration of the pandemic. But as you mentioned, this is the tip of the iceberg of the work that we need to do. But I also believe that promoting education and awareness of these scams is critical in reducing harm to Americans. A lot of people, particularly seniors, just aren't well aware of these scams. My mother is 80, and I can tell you that she calls me all the time and says, "Hey, I got this call or I got this email," and I'm like, "Mother, that's a scam." And so this is real, and it hits home for everyone. I also know as a surgeon that using appropriate and approved medical equipment is critical in achieving positive outcomes during the pandemic for both patients and healthcare providers. So I'm going to focus a little bit on that. Ms. Ponte, have warnings of fraudulent personal protective equipment obtained in scams been part of the Spokane COPS community outreach when promoting the proper usage of various personal protective equipment?
Thank you. To be honest with you, we are not seeing a large number of fraudulent vaccinations or remedies or personal protective devices. We're not seeing that really in the Spokane area too much.
Well, that's good to hear, because across the country, you know, this has been a pretty substantial problem where products that are supposed to be protective are not. Or as you mentioned, now we're seeing fraudulent vaccines and other things as it relates to COVID-19. As you mentioned earlier, this hearing, falling victim to a scam also causes serious mental health concerns, and victims may be too embarrassed to admit they were scammed. And I know that is true. They won't even admit it to family members. As I mentioned, my mother, she was a victim of a scam. Fortunately, it wasn't that significant, but I didn't know about it until I went to her house. And I'm like, and I won't get in detail, but I'm like, well, where did you get this thing? Well, somebody called me. So I know that. You know, she was embarrassed, and also it causes mental health concerns. Can you speak to some of the issues you've seen and how we can best address providing support in this area for victims?
You know, we really need to be stepping up as communities and taking care of our elderly population. You know, a lot of the folks, you know, especially in their 70s, 80s, don't have Wi-Fi, they don't have laptops, they don't have smartphones. And so they really are feeling the isolation. They might get something in the mail. And, you know, these folks have good hearts. They want to send money to these different agencies to help, you know, support whatever mission they're on. And so it's more difficult. And I almost think that it falls heavily on family members being educated and having those hard conversations with their mothers and their fathers. We don't want to disrespect our mothers and fathers, you know. We want to have them keep their independence. We do not want them to feel foolish and those things. So it really is important that our adult children really do that follow-up and get that information to their mothers and fathers. Churches is another great forum because a lot of this population do go to their local churches, town halls, senior community centers, places like that, places that they go and frequent, assisted living centers. So those are areas that would benefit from brochures and education.
Ms. Patton, do you have any comments on that, or anyone else on the panel want to comment on this, the PPE situation where the fraudulent stuff related specifically to COVID and what you're seeing and what we can do?
Yes, Tina.org has received numerous complaints from consumers that have ordered PPE on the internet and failed to get it. We've also seen many advertisers putting the FDA logo or saying that they're FDA approved, when obviously that's not the case on Amazon and eBay. So it's been a huge issue.
Okay. Well, I'm out of time, so I'll yield back. Thank you, Chair Schakowsky.
Thank you. I think Congresswoman Dingell is not back yet. I'm going to move on then to my Illinois sister, Congresswoman Robin Kelly for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and welcome to the ranking member. As much as I love Kathy Castor, I say ABB, anybody but Brady on Sunday. But anyway, thank you to the witnesses. The coronavirus pandemic has been ripe territory for scammers, as we all know. Criminals have taken advantage and have profited from confusion and hardship. Seniors in particular have been targeted during this pandemic. Ms. Patton, many seniors struggle with technology and lack digital literacy skills. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, many are now having to rely on the internet more than ever, including for booking COVID-19 vaccine appointments. In some states, vaccine appointments need to be booked online, leaving those who can't navigate the internet at risk of falling prey to fake vaccine appointment websites. Have you seen seniors targeted during the pandemic, and what should they keep in mind to guard against falling victim to a scam?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the largest scams that seniors fall victim to is tech support scams, right, on the computer, because they do struggle. So it has been a huge issue. And, you know, it's hard to stop. I think that seniors also are primarily scammed using the telephone. And while there is an ability for local, state, and federal agencies to find scams on the internet or in print, it's much harder when the scam is perpetrated over the telephone. So it's a huge issue, and I know one that is being examined by agencies at every governmental level.
Thank you. Ms. Rich, when you were the Bureau Director, you created the Every Community program to ensure the FTC was reaching a diverse set of communities. What were the major successes of the program, and what were the obstacles you ran?
Well, it was an incredibly important program, and we had ambitious plans for it. It was not only outreach to different communities, but research to see how successful we were doing in reaching out to different communities, and enforcement to make sure that the enforcement in the areas where we saw problems. And one of the challenges we found in the data that we did collect at the time, it turned out that certain populations, specifically African-American and Latino populations, were disproportionately targeted by fraud, but were underreporting fraud, but weren't reporting fraud in as great numbers to the FTC, showing that the FTC was not capturing the complaints it needed and had a lot more work to do. I don't know exactly what the agency has been doing since I left. I know in their outreach that they do a lot to reach out to different communities, but I think this program really needs to be scaled up now with additional research, with more resources devoted to this, to making sure that all these communities are represented, and with everybody at the agency working on this goal.
And how do you think the FTC should prioritize its resources toward combating scams? I mean, you know, there's so many different ones targeted toward older consumers.
I would say, based on past experience, I don't have access to the details now, that the fraud program is at least 50% of what the FTC does between its headquarters and regional offices. And given the pervasiveness of scams, I think that's appropriate that it be such a large program, and it should continue to invest those kind of resources.
Thank you so much. I want to let my colleagues know that I've reintroduced the bipartisan Protecting Seniors from Emergency Scams Act, and I hope my colleagues will join me as co-sponsoring this very important legislation to protect seniors. So thank you so much, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
He's off camera. Can I ask? Yeah, is Mr. Dunn here? No? Give me a signal if you are. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to Representative Lesko for 5 minutes. Representative Lesko, are you here?
Done. Done. I guess it's back.
Don, are you here? Okay, you're recognized. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Oh, no. Unmute. Unmute. Okay.
Is that to me or to Representative Lesko?
No, if you're there, Mr. Dunn, and that's you.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought you...
recognized. Okay.
I apologize. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm grateful that we're here today discussing this important topic of fighting back against scams and frauds during the COVID-19. I'm not. What is new is the fraud now carries a new risk, not just a financial toll, but an increased potential for damage to their health and well-being as well. For that reason, this is more important than ever. I'm particularly concerned with scams targeted towards veterans, seniors, and those living in rural communities, like the ones I represent in Florida's 2nd Congressional District. To date, we have seen a commendable effort by our local partners in raising awareness and preventing these scams. Ms. Patton, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a lot of groups impacted. Specifically, though, I'm concerned right in this question about our military veterans. And can you speak toward the work that TINA.org is doing with groups to represent those communities?
Right. Well, TINA.org provides a platform for consumers to come to complain to us about issues. And we've received multiple complaints from military veterans that have been finding products, especially wellness products, supplements, that are claiming to either prevent, cure, or mitigate the symptoms of COVID-19. And I should note that one of the issues we're finding is that the supplements and the products, they're not new. What's new is the marketing. They've pivoted. So before they were targeting military veterans with these same products saying they could cure, prevent, or treat PTSD. And now they're COVID cures. And
what remedies do the military, are you directing our veterans and military towards any particular remedies?
Right. So on TINA.org, we have listed state, federal, and local agencies that they can complain to and share their issues with.
Thanks so very much. Ms. Ponte, our local law enforcement has been a very valuable resource in terms of education on scams, especially for frauds that originate outside our region. What helpful tools can Congress provide you or whoever in order to help local law enforcement on scams that originate remotely?
You know, one of the things when I was talking to a detective about fraud investigations is that she's having a difficult time getting this information for investigations. And it would be helpful if when the time comes, Federal Trade Commission could step up or step in and help get that information to our law enforcement so they can look at getting convictions and maybe, you know, put somebody in jail over this. They are very good too about getting the education out there. Most of the education for identity theft and fraud really does come from our cop shops. We get a lot of referrals and we are able to walk them through this process of reporting, plus provide them with brochures and just firsthand knowledge. I think they like talking to a live person versus having something in their hand at times and reading something online. So we provide that.
So I thank you. And I thank you specifically for bringing in the role of the pawn shops, who've been very helpful, honestly, in our community on that as well. Ms. Patton, once again, the pandemic certainly has created isolation for so many people that used to get their advice and kind of guidance from their friends and their workplaces, community events, churches, et cetera. Can you walk us through some of the details of how your organization reaches the people in more rural communities in our current situation of isolation?
Right. So I think it's important that you have to reach consumers where they are. And where they are now is social media. So Tina.org is very active on Facebook. We actually take out ads to warn consumers about scams and schemes that are on Facebook or on the internet. And we also are very active on Twitter to try and educate consumers and get the word out as much as possible.
Thank you for that comment. I see my time has expired. I too see a face of the social medias out there in the rural communities. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. You may have noticed the witnesses that were in and out. That's because votes are happening. Is Mr. Pallone here to, okay, Frank, I'm gonna announce the next person. I think Debbie Dingle is not back. So Congressman Soto, you are next. And Frank, I'm gonna go vote.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We all understand that American families are in crisis. They're losing loved ones, losing their jobs and small businesses, facing home insecurity and food insecurity. So it's understandable that they're desperate for solutions to these problems that they face, which makes them more vulnerable to scams. COVID-19 scams kick people while they're down. And we must put an end to this scamster carnival barkery that runs rampant throughout the United States. According to the Florida Attorney General Office, we've seen several rampant themes of scams. Common COVID scams in Florida include unsubstantiated disinfectant claims, treatment, vaccine, and cure false claims, sham at-home testing kits, federal stimulus scams, fraudulent products, charity scams, unsolicited calls, texts, and emails, and home solicitations. The latest scam in Florida as of this January are vaccination scams, suspicious texts or emails claiming to have info about the vaccine in exchange for personal information. This is disgraceful. So the question becomes, how can we protect consumers without penalties, without restitution for victims? This would render the FTC a toothless tiger, feared by no one, and leaving scammed consumers defenseless. It's clear we have to act on 13B to ensure that the FTC can continue to obtain restitution for victims. Ms. Patton, we recently passed in December COVID-19 Consumer Protection Act. My question to you is this being sufficiently used already by the FTC? Do you anticipate gaps in this law, realizing it just was passed?
To my knowledge, the FTC has not yet used that act, but that's the only information I know, that there's no public on their website. It does have gaps. You cannot target work from home scams using this because it's really focused primarily on government benefit scams and healthcare scams. But what I would say is that while it's absolutely critical to have an act like this at this time during the pandemic, I would warn you that it doesn't provide for coverage for the next disaster, for the next earthquake, for the next fire, what have you. There are, unfortunately, will always be a segment of our population that is in devastating events. And so I think that legislation is necessary that covers all such events and not just focused on the pandemic.
Thank you, Ms. Patton. And I hope the FTC is on notice. We want them to start utilizing this act, and we're certainly paying attention. And thank you for your comments on additional ways we could fill these gaps. Mr. Kovacic, you have called upon in your initial statement $1 billion for the FTC budget. If we were able to secure these funds, what important items do you think the funding should be used for to protect consumers?
I think we can go through the list of items that have been mentioned. One is a major expansion of law enforcement. That is, bring more cases, bring more visible cases. Second, much deeper collaboration, as I've mentioned before, with criminal enforcement authorities to build the criminal cases. I think we would have a much greater raising of public awareness, certainly among wrongdoers who are geographically mobile, they're technologically proficient, they understand gaps in the law, and they have been building experience going from one scam to another to bring visible criminal prosecutions. I'd spend money on that. I'd spend money on the outreach effort that we've been referring to build better networks with a collection of government and non-government institutions to develop the capacity to analyze complaints in real time and target attention on vulnerable communities. I'd spend the money to learn more about how commerce and fraud take place in historically disadvantaged communities. I would spend the money on doing the better public education that we've been speaking with. I would spend the money on building better networks with public and non-government organizations, civic organizations. I'd spend the money on the capital investment to build up the technological capacity to analyze and build databases and use them effectively. That would be my short list of what to do. And I would think ahead about the moment when we're going to have new privacy legislation. The FTC is being asked to bring big cases against big tech companies across the boards. None of this is cheap to do. This is how I'd use my $1 billion. And of course, were I in your position, I'd say, I'm going to come back regularly to see what the return is to this kind of effort. But notice how many times you've been saying in the past 2 hours plus, we're going to do more outreach, more education, more cases, more. It costs.
Thank you,
I think
Mr.
we could use
Kravasik.
the money profitably.
And my time's expired.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Soto. We now go to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence, recognized for 5 minutes. Greg, you gotta unmute, I think. Mr. Pence?
All right, my apologize. I always
that's all right.
criticize everybody when they do that. Thank you, Mr. Malone. Sorry about that. Chair Sikowski and Ranking Member Bilirakis, thanks for calling this meeting today. Thank you to the witnesses. It's been very interesting listening to you today. Thanks for coming here to engage on the topic of COVID frauds and scams, which we've heard a lot about and we've all experienced a lot about. From fake stimulus checks to phony pet adoption sites, scammers are seizing the opportunities during the pandemic to prey on vulnerable Americans. Like Congressman Bouchon, my mother and stepfather have had the same problems. Thank God they call us and ask us first. Not everybody has that opportunity or that luxury. Unfortunately, many Hoosiers are not immune from these scams. Over the past year alone, Indiana has reported almost 4,400 scams to the FTC, accounting for an estimated loss of $1.9 million. Many of the fraud schemes have shadowed the evolution of the COVID-19 response. In April, hospitals in my district raised the issue many times of non-traditional medical suppliers engaging in deceptive price gouging of scarce PPE, as much as $50 sometimes for some of that equipment. Then with the passage of the CARES Act, scammers took advantage of critical relief intended for individuals and families. Now we're seeing fraudulent claims around vaccine distribution all over the country. But recently, Indiana governor highlighted how pandemic unemployment relief programs in the state have become target of fraudsters and scammers. Similar to the situation you highlighted in your testimony, Ms. Ponto, criminals are gathering personal information from websites and social media to apply for benefits in their victims' names. I think we talked about the IRS dollars showing up on some people's returns. The state uncovered a fake website scam that closely mimicked the Indiana Department of Workforce Development webpage to trick individuals into giving up their information for unemployment. Not only does this result in a loss of resources for the state, it's creating significant delays in the ongoing verification process for Hoosiers out of work and seeking that assistance as quickly as they can get it. Ms. Ponto, have you seen this type of scam increase? And how would you recommend we stay ahead of the curve to prepare for these schemes so that Hoosier relief programs are not obstructed or delayed?
Thank you. I did. This spring, when it first came about, I got hit hard with companies, universities and companies, not individuals, that got hacked over this unemployment security department scams. And I don't know what the question is. That should have been very secure, in my opinion. Department of Corrections was struck. That's a huge entity. So I'm not sure what the answer is. I just know that we all have a role to play, and we've got to all work together to figure that out. One of the things I did find interesting was one of the detectives I talked to said that she has a daughter who's a minor that has Social Security disability. And within a week, the detective herself actually started receiving AARP paperwork applications because they thought that the Social Security disability was from her, not this minor. So somewhere along the lines, we've got this sale of personal information that's going back and forth, and that probably needs to stop too, because what all is in that information that's going elsewhere and out there? So I don't know what the answer is as far as the unemployment benefits. I fear with this newest hack that is just coming about with the auditor's office that this is just the tip of the iceberg. They're getting so smart and they work all day on doing this. So I don't know what the answer is.
All right, thank you for what you do, Ms. Ponto. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Next, Ms. Stingle's not here, so we'll go to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Rice, Kathleen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the epicenter of the initial coronavirus outbreak in the U.S., state and local officials in my state of New York and in my district on Long Island were also the first to deal with the issue of price gouging. So at the start of the pandemic, a pharmacy in my district, for instance, was selling N95 masks for $5 each from open boxes of 20. And then in another part of town, we had hand sanitizer going for all different amounts for tiny sizes, ounce sizes of, up to $10 for a 4-ounce bottle. And this was all within, 3 different locations within a 10-minute drive apart from each other. Nassau County, which my district sits in, made a little bit of history when federal prosecutors brought the first case in the nation under the Defense Production Act against the owner of a warehouse store who was hoarding more than 4 tons of personal protective equipment and marking up items by as much as 1,328%. So Ms. Rich, if I could start with you. In my district, we were able to overcome these challenges because we had strong local leadership and we mobilized our Department of Consumer Affairs. Can you just talk a little bit about how the FTC has or hasn't responded to price gouging complaints during the pandemic?
Yes. So I'm not an expert on price gouging because it's typically handled on the competition side of things rather than consumer protection. But I understand that when the FTC looks at this issue, it looks at it through its unfairness authority, which requires a detailed cost-benefit analysis of price changes, of the reasons behind it, of the effect on consumers and competition. And its unfairness authority is not a nimble way to respond to a fast-moving problem. A better way, which would be more similar to what happens with the states, would be for Congress to decide to set forth legislation establishing standards for price gouging, but similar to what happens in the states, where they define it either by a percentage or fluctuations that happen within a certain period of time compared to the prices, 5 days ago or whatever. The clearer standards would allow for much more nimble enforcement than unfairness. And then the FTC could enforce those standards in the way that you want.
So do you think it's that's one of those issues that should be handled at the local level?
This 34 states have legislation. You were just talking about how effectively it was done at the local level, but there may be companies that operate nationwide, which would make it appropriate for the FTC to handle something like that.
Well, certainly, with the increase in various e-commerce platforms, it made it harder for local officials to go after price gougers who are on the other side of the country or on the other side of the planet. So I guess that's a specific role for the FTC to play. So I think it's really important, if you talk about Section 13B, and what I'm hearing from every single witness here today is that Congress needs to act forthwith. So I just want to maybe have, Ms. Rach or Mr. Kovacic, or anyone who has an opinion about this. So it's one thing in terms of what the Supreme Court's going to rule on in terms of recouping stolen money. But maybe talk a little bit more about what additional penalties. I think it was Mr. Kovacic who was talking about the lack of, if you look at what happened with the stealing the tips from taxi or delivery drivers. That's just absurd that, we call it a victory just because we got the money back and we're going to distribute it to the victims. But so maybe just talk a little bit more about what Congress should look at in terms of additional penalties other than just recouping, allowing the FTC broad jurisdiction to recoup lost money.
Yes, penalties are a very important area too. And many agencies like the CFPB and many state AG's office have the capacity to impose penalties in a way the FTC doesn't, even though the FTC has this enormous jurisdiction and mission to deter this behavior. I think Congress should consider giving FTC penalties across the board, but at the very least, in certain key areas like privacy, like the gig economy was an area that we just talked about with what just happened with Amazon, and that was something that the acting chair is supporting. In certain areas of fraud where they can't get penalties at this point, that would be very important as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Next we go to, I thought I saw Mr. Armstrong. Is he there? Oh, yeah. The gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Cardenas referenced a 13B proposal by Senator Wicker. I believe that was part of the senator's privacy proposal, so I think we would all be pleased to see it move as part of a broader effort. Given that, I would just like to ask our two FTC veterans on the panel this. If we're going to address 13B and consider first offense penalties for privacy violations in rulemaking authority, it doesn't make sense for individual states to add conflicting rules and allow private rights of action, correct? It's easier when reversed, you can just do it, but yeah, please.
Preemption and private right of action are some of the key issues that are subject to the debate. if state laws, if there's any discussion of preempting state laws, at the very least, the state should be able to enforce the law, any law that's passed at the federal level.
First, I applaud the sense of urgency with which you and your colleagues, congressmen, are approaching the development of a comprehensive nationwide privacy policy. At the moment, our national privacy policy is being set in California and Brussels, and we don't have one at the national level. So I think it certainly deserves your attention. My intuition on private rights is that I'd perhaps begin by creating the robust public enforcement framework, which is the collaboration between the federal and state authorities. I would see how that works for a while, and I'd take stock of that in 5 years and decide what kind of private enforcement I want to develop. Maybe you develop private enforcement that is a follow-on to the state and federal enforcement. But I think you have a great deal of room to maneuver and to shape the program in a way that reflects the competing interests that have been brought to bear in the fruitful debate you're having about private rights. On the preemption, I would like to preserve in general a framework that promotes coherence at the national level. Because the states in a number of instances have had very useful additions to the framework by way of experimentation, I would like to preserve some capacity on their part to perhaps go beyond provisions of the national coverage and to experiment with new techniques that could be adopted and brought into the federal scheme. I confess I don't have an excellent administrative mechanism to do that, and I hesitate a bit because I see the benefits of the broad coherence, but I also see benefits that states have brought to the process by being able to do things that the federal system has not done at the moment. So I would like a mechanism that incorporates both of those elements in policy making.
Well, I appreciate that. As a former chair of a state Senate Judiciary Committee, I can tell you two things. We like to have state authority, and I don't, with all due respect to my good friend Congresswoman Castor, North Dakota politics and California politics are pretty significantly distinct and different, but we sure seem to get a lot of uniform laws that are based out of California. So just as we go through this, I want to just point out a couple things. And one, I'm excited to be on this committee. No offense to all of my colleagues on Judiciary and Oversight, but we've made it well into 2 hours and nobody's yelling at each other yet. So that's, it's very different. And two, I just so as we're doing in the actual COVID thing, according to the FTC, North Dakota's had over 270 COVID-related scams. And we're actually really lucky. We have a great attorney general who has been on top of these things and has started warning our consumers about it as early as last April. But I just want to be clear real quick that product liability is actually almost always primarily a state law function. And it's a principle that manufacturers, sellers, strict liability and defective consumer products. I do think we have to have a broader, and I'm glad people were asking question about Section 230 and how it applies as online retailers become part of the entire distribution chain, and the distinction between an online retailer and that. And then I would also just say we have to be careful in anything we do that doesn't further entrench the big guys and decrease competition. And with that, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now we're going to move to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Thanks for yielding, and thanks for having me on this committee and on this subcommittee. I'm super excited to be here. I want to expand on the conversation in my question to you and highlight the work on COVID-19 that I began in the last Congress on scams related to COVID-19 with my fellow Minnesota Congressman Pete Stauber. Together, we introduced a bill called the Stop Coronavirus Scams Act of 2020, which would double the applicable forfeiture penalty, criminal fine, and term of imprisonment for anyone who provides misleading or inaccurate caller information in an attempt to defraud, cause harm, or wrongfully obtain anything of value by using false information related to COVID-19. While this bill primarily deals with the FCC's existing authorities under the Communications Act, I wanted to bring it up in the context of the comment you made about fraud not occurring in a bubble and how it relates to other entities, individuals, and systems to function, including the platforms and conduits through which scam artists disseminate fraudulent information. You note in your testimony that among the warning letters that the FTC sent regarding COVID-19 scams were letters to voice over internet protocol providers and other companies warning them that routing and transmitting illegal robocalls related to COVID-19 is against the law. In one of those joint letters sent by the FTC and FCC, the agencies noted that these unwanted robocalls included messages alleging that recipients have been charged almost $400 for tech support services, but may receive a refund by responding to the robocall. They also included robocalls falsely claiming to come from the United States Social Security Administration, threatening cutoff of SSA benefits. Clearly, these activities have the potential to inflict harm on consumers. Given the severity of the ongoing crisis, do you feel these bad actors would be less willing to engage in fraudulent activities if the fines and penalties were increased for covered communications related to COVID-19? And are there any other actions, including legislative fix to 13B, that Congress should be contemplating in this area?
I think that strong fines and penalties, and I haven't reviewed your act, but it sounds like there's criminal penalties would be very important to deter these terrible acts. But I also think that the responsibility of platforms is very, very important. And 230, of course, is a very complex undertaking and beyond the 230 reform and beyond the subject matter of this hearing. But I do think that this subcommittee can be thinking about other responsibilities to impose on these platforms and large hosts of other content, short of 230 reform, along the lines of the Informed Consumers Act, that would actually spell out duties as opposed to imposing strict liability and have everybody wonder what it is they're supposed to do. Would impose specific duties on the platforms to screen out some of this content.
Ms. Rich, I really appreciate you and all of the panelists being here today. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you. So now we go to the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be a new member of this committee, and I thank all of the witnesses for their testimony. Earlier on in the testimony, Ms. Ponto, you had said you would suggest we need more help from the FTC. And so can you give examples of where you needed help from the FTC and it was possibly a little bit lacking? Like, could you give us concrete examples of how you could get more help from the FTC? What specifically?
Thank you. So I reached out to detectives at Spokane Police Department just to find out more about the fraud that they were seeing, because they're the ones who are going to put the bad guys in jail. And in my opinion, that's what we need to be doing. What she gave me an example is that there was a particular case where we had an elderly victim and she lived in an assisted living center. Her adult son was her power of attorney, and he was in charge of all of her finances. One of the caregivers at the assisted living center started stealing credit cards from multiple residents. And so in an effort for the adult son, the power of attorney, to go and get the evidence from his elderly mom's accounts, He had all of his documentation, he had his paperwork, and he went to the first credit card company. They declined to help him or give him the information he needed. So then he went to the bank and they helped him get information on her accounts. But if his name was not on a credit card, then he did not get that information. He then went to the detective. He signed all the paperwork, all the authorization forms, showed the power of attorney. She ended up having to write 3 different search warrants because she kept coming up with roadblocks. At the first business, they claimed that they had contracted out to someone else. So really you need to do the search warrant at the second place. So she goes to the second place. They played a game of, well, you know what? This is not really our business address. This one is. So she ended up writing 3 warrants by the time it was said and done. 2 months it took for her to get the account information, 2 months. And in that time that she got that paperwork, she only got a third of it. She didn't even get everything that she needed to possibly bring charges against this caregiver. What she wanted to specifically address that under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, businesses are required to provide this information. And the FTC wants to hear if we are not getting that kind of cooperation. But the problem is that she did not feel like there was any teeth from the FTC, that maybe it was a threat or get it done, but there was nothing that caused them to make sure that she got all the information that she needed. And so it really would have been quite helpful if they would have stepped in at that stage and be able to help get our detectives the information they need from these different financial institutions or credit card places, so they can bring charges to these folks, put some in jail.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Ponto. And maybe maybe I'll go to Ms. Rich next then, since you used to work at the FTC, and see if you have any comments about what Ms. Ponto said. I mean, one of the other witnesses said the pay is lower at the FTC and found that as a problem. Do you need more staff there? Why are these things falling through the crack, in your opinion?
I don't know why that particular issue fell through the crack. I also don't, to be honest, I don't recall whether this particular provision of the FCRA is enforceable and has teeth. But I can assure you that the FTC is watching this hearing today and is taking this very seriously, what Ms. Ponto was talking about, because working with partners on identity theft is hugely important. The FTC desperately does need more resources. If they are paid less than other agencies, but I don't think that stops the commitment to work diligently to help consumers. So many people there are already working for much less than they would in other places they could be working. But the number of staff, I mean, sure, give them what they deserve to be paid, but the issue is more the strain on the number of staff. You think about, you on this subcommittee know more than anyone the broad mission of the agency and what it's tasked to do and how it's very small compared to other agencies, but its mission is huge.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back.
Okay, and I am back. And so let me catch up. Has Congresswoman Tran, have you asked your questions yet, or is it your turn?
I think it's my turn.
Okay, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Schakowsky and Ranking Member Bilrakis. And for the record, as New England sits on the sidelines watching the Super Bowl this year, I, for one, will happily take the goat back. So go Bucks. Hey, so first, thanks to all the witnesses for testifying today on behalf of the many victims of fraud who have been cheated with phony lures about COVID treatments and cures, and really appreciate you hanging for the duration. Ms. Rich, I want to focus my question on what more the FTC can be doing to protect consumers and deter bad behavior by fraudsters. And like my colleague from Minnesota, I was compelled by your observation that, quote, fraud does not happen in a bubble. It relies on other systems to function. And this very point was raised by Consumer Reports with the FTC last summer in comments about the need for clearer guidance on online reviews and endorsements. And they wrote, quote, social media sorting algorithms tend to prioritize posts that receive more engagement from users with higher followers, providing further incentives for marketers to use deceptive tactics to augment those numbers, end quote. I'm convinced that they've put their finger on the heart of this issue and the broader challenge of social media misinformation and disinformation, the faulty incentive structures involved in these algorithms. Now, recognizing that you are no longer with Consumer Reports, I'd like to ask your thoughts on how we can better rein in these practices used by scammers to make products look more popular than they are. How else can the FTC update the endorsement guides to keep pace with these manipulation strategies in the online marketplace and social media?
Well, I'm no longer with the FTC or with Consumer Reports, but I was in both places. So I'm very sympathetic to everything that you're talking about. Deceptive endorsements are a horrible problem. The FTC has comprehensive guides, and it brought a lot of enforcement actually, but this is pervasive, and the enforcement hasn't been able to make at all a dent in this problem. And of course, because of the rapid development on social media, it changes its format all the time. And while the deceptive the endorsement guides have specific examples, when the FTC only updates its rules and guides like every 10 years, it's just not enough to keep pace. So I'm very sympathetic to all of those points that have been made by Consumer Reports and you. This may be an area where more teeth are needed because of the pervasiveness of this problem. Maybe a rulemaking, and I think this is something that Commissioner Chopra raised when the comments went out, that and I know Consumer Reports also mentioned maybe there need to be more bright lines here. And if there was a rule enacted, then there could be civil penalties for it. So of course, the best way to get this done would be for Congress to authorize APA rulemaking and the Commission to pass a rule, because otherwise it's got to use its cumbersome Magnuson-Moss procedures. But I really do think there needs to be more teeth in what the FTC can do in this area, because it can't make a dent.
Great. That's super helpful. Ms. Patton, following off of Ms. Rich's comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. I mean, you went straight after Section 230 in your testimony, but you also noted that narrower approaches are on the table, like Senator Baldwin's Cool Online Act. With respect to the specific issue of endorsement guides, do you see room for improvement at the FTC as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, we can't ask the FTC to do more unless they have more resources available to them. And of course, we have seen a change in, endorsements from influencers, started out with clothing and private jets, but now, we're getting to serious issues when it comes to treatments and preventions for COVID. So obviously that's an area where the FTC is incredibly concerned, but they don't have the resources. I mean, if you look at Instagram alone and you search the hashtag COVID-19, you're going to come up with more than 20 million hits. No human can go through that. So they need the technology and resources to really address this issue. And I absolutely agree that updated endorsement guides are needed, and that penalty authority for first-time offenders on social media influencers would be incredibly helpful.
Thank you. I'll try to squeeze in my last one, but if I get cut off, that's fine. You know, Mr. Kovacic, I was intrigued by your recommendation that the FTC borrow some of the lessons from UK's Competition and Markets Authority, particularly its establishment of a data unit. As one of our panel's insider experts on the FTC, can you expand upon your reasoning that the FTC should adopt something similar? And if I'm out of time, I'm happy to submit that question for the record.
Notice that just a moment ago, Congresswoman, you were referring to algorithms and the ability to understand what goes on inside these systems. Part of the rationale for the UK development of a data unit, which has 40 people, mostly technologists, not lawyers and economists, but real technologists, is one to understand what's going on inside those processes, to do searches, intelligent searches that allow you to figure out what's in that mass of 20 million hits, what's going on there, and to distill some lessons about what's taking place in the marketplace. During COVID, this group was doing almost real-time assessments with respect to complaints, patterns in complaints, identifying within a couple of days where the hot spots were with wrongdoers, repeated indications so you could focus attention. And now they have a major program that they've just launched to use their new study in algorithms on both the competition and consumer side to get a better idea of how firms use algorithms to target individual vulnerable consumers and to prey upon them. And
okay, I'm gonna have to. We're over a minute over, and I'm gonna have to cut you.
My first subcommittee meeting, and I went over. I apologize. Thank you so much to the witnesses.
Okay, and you know, you can put something in writing or reach out to him personally. I understand that Debbie Dingle is there. Congresswoman Dingle, are you there?
I am. Thank you,
Okay,
Madam
it's your
Chair.
turn for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Sorry, I was overvoting. So, and thank you for holding this hearing today. It's a very important one, and we've learned a lot listening to all of the questions on both sides of the aisle. You know, this pandemic has made us more isolated than ever, which leaves people, as we've all been talking about, turning to the internet, social media, and other resources in search of community. They just want to talk to somebody, help and comfort. And many of the scams that my colleagues have been talking about today and the witnesses highlighted prey on people's loneliness and fear during this unprecedented time and can originate and do originate and proliferate on these platforms. Scams have affected, we've heard the stories from some of you, struggling families, people then embarrassed to tell somebody something happened, individuals seeking employment during the crisis, and seniors who are just plain scared and desperate trying to protect themselves and those around them from the virus. It's unconscionable that during this unprecedented time, individuals and families cannot be certain of what's real and what's not real of the products and services that the victims of these scams cannot receive the compensation for they deserve. And just for the record, I've got a file that thick of ones that I have gotten. And some days I don't even know, you know, I'll get hey, your Yahoo Mail is about to be cut off. Give us this too, or the Amazon. And I have hearings like this and you teach me, and it's pretty scary. So FTC guidelines and authorities need to meet the demands of evolving technology and tactics and reflect our continuing priority of protecting consumers. So that's what we've been talking about. So let's start by discussing social media consumption habits and its impact on consumers' vulnerability to frauds and scams. Last August, there was a new report that discriminatory ads are still appearing on Facebook, even after the landmark settlement in 2019 that Facebook violated federal anti-discrimination laws. It appears that advertisers are able to use Facebook's platform to micro-target populations based on their identities of age and race. Mr. Rich and/or Ms. Patton, could tools that Facebook provide to micro-target ads be used by scammers to target and exploit vulnerable populations, exacerbating these harms And what steps are social media companies and the FTC taking to prevent such abuses?
Well, the settlement you discussed between Facebook and the civil rights groups was landmark. And it gave the civil rights groups, it prohibited advertising that would enable discriminatory ads on Facebook. And Facebook, in implementing its response to the settlement, announced changes to its platforms that would cut off certain demographic information to advertisers. It also, the settlement, gave the civil rights groups certain rights to access and test the platforms to see if they were working now better and complying with the settlement. And one question I have is whether how effective that is. You know, the civil rights groups don't have subpoena authority. They don't have law enforcement authority. And so it doesn't compare to a federal investigation. So one thing I wondered when I was thinking about this is whether there should be a role given to the FTC here to look at this type of violation. The privacy bills from last year, both from this subcommittee and on the Senate side, Cantwell and Wicker, did give a role to the FTC in examining the use of algorithms and discrimination based on those algorithms. So I wonder if that should be revisited to give the FTC role to help the civil rights groups to supplement what the civil rights groups are doing to try to solve this problem.
Well, I'd like to follow up after this with more to see if there's something we should pursue, and that with the chair, we would look at. Ms. Patton, since I only have 23 seconds, did you want to add anything? And I'll do the rest of my questions for the record. Ms. Patton, any comments?
No, I think Ms. Rich did a wonderful job of covering it. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, with 7 seconds left, I've never been known to talk for a short period of time. I'll yield back.
Well, thank you. And I want to be sure, is Congresswoman Fletcher still here?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay, then you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Chairwoman Schakowsky and Ranking Member Bilirakis for organizing today's hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to hear from these witnesses about protecting consumers from fraud during this health and economic crisis. I appreciate the insights and share so many of the information, the perspectives that many of my colleagues have shared about the damage that this fraud is creating in their own communities. And my community in Houston is no different. But I want to get to a couple of questions just right off the bat. Ms. Patton, in your testimony, you mentioned that there was a need for the civil penalty fund to compensate consumers who've been monetarily harmed. And can you expand on the potential for this type of fund and how it would interact with settlements from individual cases? How can we ensure that this type of fund will be well funded enough to provide meaningful compensation?
Yes, thank you. So as it currently stands, when the FTC is able to use its penalty authority, for example, in the Facebook example where it violated an order and they got billions of dollars, that money went into the general treasury. I would propose that what is absolutely needed is if that money was put into a fund that could reimburse victims of fraud and scams. So often the FTC using 13B authority comes upon a defendant that doesn't have the resources to reimburse victims. And so if it had a fund, it could use that money to make victims whole that have been, scammed from their money.
Thank you. That's helpful. And following up on that question, I think Mr. Rich, you also mentioned Chairwoman Schakowsky's leadership in allowing the FTC to impose fines on perpetrators related to COVID-19 fraud for the duration of the public health crisis. Other than this issue of 13B, is there additional short-term legislative action needed to address the COVID frauds effectively?
COVID fraud specifically?
Ms. Rich, sorry, yes.
No, that's okay. I think I'm not sure about the code. As Ms. Patton noted, there are gaps in the in the December legislation, but other than 13B, I really am focused on the broader picture too of civil penalties more broadly. I also agree with Ms. Patton that a civil penalty fund would be enormously helpful, and it's something that the CFPB already has. So there is a model there that another consumer agency is already using, and that also would help during this, certainly would help during this period as well as afterwards.
And I apologize, since as Chairwoman Chikowski noted, we've run back and forth to vote. So you may have answered this already and I may have missed it. And if so, I apologize. But in putting together that fund, and in terms of there's a model at the CFPB, how would you imagine would be sort of the most effective way if we were to design this kind of program for that to be administered?
The CFPB model allows you to take money that is obtained in a civil penalty case and use it to distribute redress to consumers in another case involving civil penalties. Now, I don't know why it's designed that way. It may be because to allow too much crossover between redress and civil penalty cases violates something. But the more flexibility that the FTC could have in using the money from these funds to compensate consumers, the better.
And is there any other, if this committee were to draft legislation to address this challenge, is there any other information or powers that you think the FTC would need to be granted legislatively to make this possible?
I think you could enact it and it would happen in the same way that the Dodd-Frank Act gave this power to the CFPB.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ms. Rich, for that. I've only got 22 seconds, but if I can go to Mr. Kovacic very quickly. Given your experience with the United Kingdom's Competition Markets Authority, can you speak a little bit to the ability of the FTC to protect and fairly compensate Americans from international scams and fraud? And since I'm running out of time, perhaps I'll ask you that question for the record and get a written response from you following the hearing.
That's great. Short answer, the Safe Web renewal is a very important part of that infrastructure. So thank you for doing that. Happy to answer your questions too.
Thank you. And Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you. So I see that Congresswoman Clark is still here, and I want to thank you for that. And you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me thank you, Madam Chair, and let me also thank my classmate, the new ranking member for the subcommittee, Mr. Belarakis, for holding this very important and timely hearing on scams and fraud. During the public health and economic crisis, we must ensure that consumers are not taken advantage of by malicious actors, not only taken advantage of, but severely harmed. It is deeply troubling to me that throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been ongoing reports of coronavirus-related scams across the nation. These fraudulent acts range from price gouging on essential products to scams that take advantage of struggling small businesses. This simply cannot continue. During this time of crisis, we must band together to stop these efforts to defraud the American people. I'm particularly concerned about the disproportionate impacts of these scams on vulnerable communities. Communities who have already been struggling with the combined impacts of COVID-19 and economic crisis and the deep systemic inequities that are pervasive in our civil society. According to the FTC's own research, folks who are Black and Latino are more likely than their white peers to be victims of fraud, and yet data suggests that there's also a serious underreporting of fraud from these very same communities. As my colleague, Congresswoman Kelly, mentioned earlier, the FTC launched its Every Community initiative to address underlying disparities in fraud. The FTC also released a report in 2016 that set forth a comprehensive framework to specifically tackle fraud in Black and Latino communities. So, Ms. Rich, one of the report's recommendations was to bolster fraud prevention strategies in Black and Latino communities through targeted education and awareness campaigns. What steps do you think the FTC could take to better implement these fraud prevention strategies in minority communities?
Well, you're right that we had a very comprehensive plan, and I think the pandemic, if not other things, seriously impaired the ability to do that, because one part of the plan was meeting and connecting with different communities, and sometimes you really have to do that face to face. And so much of this is developing trusted relationships with different community organizations, and then they in turn can interact with their communities to encourage more information about fraud, and they can relay that back to the FTC. So I really do think it is time, even while we're still in the pandemic, we've got the videos, we've got all sorts of channels we can use to really ramp that initiative up. And it costs money because it involves materials. It should involve more research because of those findings that you just referenced. That was about the Black and Latino communities. It was a small set of findings. There's a lot more research that needs to be done to figure out more effective ways to reach out into these communities. So
I look forward to further discussing this and looking
Yes.
at ways that we can be nimble and creative in penetrating those communities that are most vulnerable. I'd like to also add native lands to that as well.
Yes.
The FTC's 2016 report also highlighted law enforcement actions that can be taken to address these disparities, including bringing more cases against entities that intentionally target or disproportionately impact vulnerable communities, Black and Latino communities. Ms. Patton, can you briefly provide some example of how scammers target minority communities?
Yes. Well, one thing that is certain is that scams do target everybody, but especially during this pandemic, when we're seeing that minority communities and people of color are being harder hit by COVID-19, we are seeing a corresponding exponential growth in scams targeting people that are suffering the most, economically and health-wise. And unfortunately, that means that many people of color and in minority communities are taking the brunt of a lot of the scams and schemes that are targeting these populations.
Well, thank you. And Madam Chair, I appreciate the time. I have additional questions that I'd like to submit and get responses for, but this is an area that is very important that we drill down and come up with strategies for combating. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back, and I thank our witnesses for their expert testimony today. Thank you.
Thank you. There are two people that have waved on to the committee. I'm going to first call on my buddy Carter, for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to wave on. And let me add also that this is my favorite subcommittee that I'm no longer on. So I appreciate it very much. Ms. Ponto, I wanted to ask you, I passed legislation, bipartisan legislation, by the way, that was signed into law in January. It's called Combating Pandemic Scams Act, and it really instructs Health and Human Services as well to work with the Postal Service as well as with the FTC to come up with a user-friendly website so that people can go to it and read about these type of scams, and also to actually enter into the website their experiences with scams so that they can become better educated as to what's going on here. Obviously, with your experience in your area, you've seen a lot of scams and other issues that have come up like this. And I was just going to ask you, could you tell us or share with me very quickly, what are some of the most egregious scams that you've noticed, and how have they been Have they been internet-based, or they've been phone-based, or what?
Thank you for that question. This is my first year. I just retired last year and took this position. So I'm still kind of learning this whole game with identity theft and fraud. But I had a gentleman come in, he was a truck driver, and he had come in, he had purchased security camera system online. He'd gotten the equipment, it didn't work. It took him a couple of months, but he ended up with somebody reaching out to him and trying to walk him through the service of getting it fixed. When they were not able to get it fixed, they said that he qualified for a refund in the amount of $400. They put $4,400 into his account. He actually got online, looked at his bank account, so he had to have shared routing numbers for them to make this refund. There it is, $4,400, kind of a generic name. He prints it out, and then of course that's when it starts. Oops, we accidentally sent you too much money. So you keep, X dollar amounts, and we would like you to go and get the rest of the refund in gift cards. We suggest you go to Fred Meyer's and Target. And again, it's this gift card scams that we're seeing, and we're not understanding how do reasonable people think this sounds right? Why are we missing the flags? And so that's what he did. And he ended up losing X amount of dollars because it was his own money that he was, putting into these gift cards, scratching off the numbers and giving it to the gentleman right over the phone, and done. This guy was calling him easily a dozen times a day. I see a lot of these scams coming in, and it's very alarming because there's an online portion to that. He showed me his bank account. When he went to the bank told him that money had never been in there in the first place. And yet here we are looking at his bank account, and there it is. So there's a sophistication level that we are not understanding, but common sense people, this doesn't look right. These are so many red flags. And so how do we get that out to our folks?
And really, this was the reason for the impetus, if you will, behind the legislation, was to educate people as to these type of scams and to help them understand and learn from this. Not only that, but have them have the opportunity to share. Now, it was primarily aimed at scams during the pandemic, which we've seen advertise ineffective PPE. We've seen advertise false cures and false preventions for the virus. That's primarily what was aimed at. Just wondering what do you think is the best line of defense? What do you, Ms. Ponto, can you share with me very quickly how can we help people the most?
I truly believe in the service that we provide, this community-oriented policing services. Like I said, we have 9 cop shops throughout our city of Spokane. They are in the neighborhoods. The neighbors, when they don't get the response that they're looking for from the police, or the police are unable to help them, they come to us because we're within blocks of them walking. And we are a fantastic first line to help them. And then we can actually walk them through the process of identity theft reporting. And I think that is a huge tool that other cities really need to take a look at.
Good. Well, thank you very much for your help and for your testimony, for all of the witnesses. And again, it's the Combating Pandemic Scams Act, and it's a good piece of legislation. It's good law now that hopefully will help people to educate people and help them to share their experiences. And again, Madam Chair, thank you for allowing me to wave on. And I yield back.
Thank you. Well, I miss you, Representative Carter, on the committee, and I also really miss Congresswoman Blunt-Rochester on the subcommittee. And I yield to you 5 minutes and welcome both of you anytime to wave on.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Schakowsky, for allowing me to wave on to this vital subcommittee, and especially for your vision for the 21st century consumer rights agenda. A powerful, powerful vision. And I too want to congratulate Ranking Member Bilirakis for his new appointment. And thank you to the witnesses for testifying. As we all know, we are in the middle of the worst public health crises in a century and a crippling recession. The last thing my constituents should be worried about is a fraud and scams. Sadly, the stories we heard at our last hearing have unfortunately not stopped. Thankfully, at the end of the last Congress, we took action, and I was proud to co-lead the Combating Pandemic Scams Act and proud to support the COVID-19 Consumer Protection Act. I will soon reintroduce my bill, the Fraud and Scams Reduction Act, which will continue to make important reforms to empower the FTC and key stakeholders. We need to take action to address the prevalence of scamming in the US. And in that regard, I'd like to begin my questions with Ms. Rich, and I'd like to follow up on Ms. Kelly's questions earlier. In your testimony, you identified the importance of reaching every community. Yet you mentioned a lack of demographic data in the FTC's current complaint database. From your experience, what kind of demographic data does FTC currently collect, and what kind of data should they be able to collect that you believe is not being collected?
Thank you. Very important issue. Well, I haven't been there for 4 years, and I know they're doing a lot with data. You can go to the website and now see all sorts of breakdowns, including by state and locality, et cetera. But when I was there, we did not collect the kind of demographic data that you need to figure out whether how scams are saturating different communities. And the findings that have been cited in this committee that fewer people in African American and Latino communities complain, but they're disproportionately victimized by fraud, was that analysis was done through workarounds using general fraud data and census data. And it was painstaking and it was very time consuming, but much more of that work is needed. And so, it's very sensitive to collect demographic data. So, and maybe the FTC's, been giving this some thought since then. So I really encourage you to engage directly with the FTC to figure out how they can get this done, because they cannot figure out what's going on the ground without it. So it's very important.
Yeah, I think one of the follow-up questions that we will have is about what authorities they would need to successfully expand this program. My next question is following up on Ms. Trahan's line of questioning as well. We were in pretty similar questions regarding, this is to Mr. Kovacic. In your testimony, you suggested that the FTC could benefit from better data analytics. Can you give us some examples of the trends that the UK watchdog identified that we would not be identified, that you would not have identified without the better data tools that and would have taken too long to identify?
Yeah, they were able to spot trends and patterns in episodes of misconduct and complaints within 2 or 3 days, instead of taking a month to sort through information. They were able to process at least week by week, very accurate profile of where the complaints were coming from, who the firms were, so that when you started your combination of warnings, lawsuits, and other publicity going out to consumers saying, here are the problems. That is, last week we saw this problem, it's happening right now, watch out for this problem. They were able to compress that kind of analysis, outreach, enforcement, education into a couple of days instead of it taking maybe a month. And on your question, Congresswoman, about doing the research, you can start to use this kind of capability as a platform to work with researchers who do this kind of analysis, academic institutions, intellectual hubs, to build a better understanding of how commerce and misconduct take place in disadvantaged communities. And you can build this capability to use those tools to get a better idea of what's going on. That is a useful partnership between the public agencies and academia.
Thank you. We'd like to follow up with you on the lessons learned by the UK that Congress can learn, as well as the FTC. Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the incredible testimony and the Q, and especially the answers that we got. I think it is obvious, I hope, to all the witnesses that this is one of the most popular hearings that I've been at. And I think one of the most revealing in terms of the suggestions that that we got. That's always so important. So thank you for what you've done. And I'm sure you're going to get some follow-up questions. And I hope that you will expect that you'll answer them promptly. And without objection, let's see, what am I? I want to add into the record, for letters from, for the record, a letter from UST, what is it? Oh, I see, US Telecom. A letter from the FTC, a letter from the Coalition of Online Accountability, and a letter from FTC to Representative Latta. And without objection, so ordered. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have, excuse me, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions to the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared. And as I said before, I ask each witness to respond promptly to any question that they may receive. And at this time, with enormous gratitude, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.